Hello everyone, I'm the Dreamland Sleep here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these stories to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time is it there? Let's get started. The rain had been falling for hours, a ceaseless drumming that matched the nervous rhythm of Owen's heartbeat. His car had died miles back, leaving him stranded on the lonely stretch of Old Hollow Road. The woods on either side loomed like jagged teeth in the faint light of his phone, its battery dwindling as fast as his hope. Ahead, through the curtain of rain, he saw it, a house. Its silhouette emerged like a ghost from the dark, its roofline jagged and broken, windows hollow as dead eyes. A single light burned in an upstairs room, flickering as if beckoning him closer. He didn't want to go. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to take his chances on the empty road, but the rain was soaking through his jacket, chilling him to the bone. The wind howled, carrying with it a whisper he couldn't quite make out. Or maybe he didn't want to. The gate creaked as he pushed it open, its rusted hinges groaning like a warning. The yard was overgrown, grass tangling around his boots, weeds clutching at his legs as though trying to pull him back. The house loomed larger with every step, its shadow swallowing him whole. Owen hesitated at the front door, his hand hovering over the cracked wood. Just shelter, he muttered to himself, trying to ignore the gnawing pit of unease in his stomach. Just until the rain stops. The door opened before he could touch it. He froze, heart thundering in his chest. The light from his phone barely penetrated the gloom inside, revealing a narrow hallway lined with faded wallpaper. It smelled of mildew and something metallic, like old blood. "Hello?" he called, his voice thin and weak against the oppressive silence. No answer. The light upstairs flickered again, drawing his gaze. He stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a soft click that made him flinch. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of something unseen. His footsteps echoed on the warped wooden floor, each creak louder than the last. The walls seemed to close in around him, the shadows shifting just beyond his vision. He reached the base of the staircase and looked up. The light at the top pulsed like a heartbeat, casting long, distorted shadows down the stairs. He swallowed hard, the sound loud in the stillness. A floorboard creaked above him. Owen's breath hitched. Someone, or something, was up there. "Hello?" he tried again, his voice trembling. The light went out. Darkness swallowed him, and for a moment he thought he heard laughter. Low, guttural, and raw. Something brushed past him, cold and fleeting, like a hand trailing over his arm. He stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet, his phone slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. When he bent to retrieve it, the screen illuminated a pair of muddy footprints leading up the stairs. They weren't his. Owen stared at the footprints, his mind racing. They were fresh, each step leaving a faint smear of mud on the warped wooden stairs. The rain outside hadn't let up, but these prints weren't waterlogged. They were dark and thick, like the earth from a freshly dug grave. He tightened his grip on his phone, its pale light the only shield against the suffocating darkness. A part of him wanted to bolt out the door and take his chances with the storm, but his legs wouldn't move. Fear rooted him in place, his breath shallow and fast. "Who's there?" he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Silence. He strained his ears, desperate for any sound. A creak, a shuffle, the faintest whisper of movement. It was there, just out of reach, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Then he heard it, a voice, faint like a thread of smoke curling through the air. "Come, upstairs?" Owen's blood ran cold. It wasn't a voice he recognized, but it felt familiar, as though it had been plucked from the edges of a half-forgotten dream. It carried an odd cadence, a strange rhythm that made the hair on his neck stand on end. "I'm just looking for shelter," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to intrude." The voice didn't respond. Instead, the light at the top of the stairs flickered back on, casting its eerie glow over the hallway. Something moved in the corner of his eye. A shadow, quick and fleeting, darting across the landing. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but his feet betrayed him. Slowly, as if pulled by invisible strings, he climbed the stairs, each step a battle against the crushing weight of dread pressing down on him. The footprints led him upward, their edges sharp and clear. He avoided stepping on them, though he couldn't explain why. It felt disrespectful. The upstairs hallway stretched out before him, lined with doors. Most were closed, their paint peeling and cracked, but one stood ajar at the far end. The light he'd seen from outside spilled out from within, pooling like liquid gold on the floorboards. As he approached, the voice came again, stronger this time. "Owen?" He froze. The voice knew his name. "How do you know me?" he demanded, his voice cracking. No answer. He reached the door, his hand trembling as he pushed it open. The room inside was small and sparsely furnished. A single chair sat in the center, facing a cracked mirror hanging on the opposite wall. The light bulb above swung gently, casting the room into shifting patterns of light and shadow. But it was the writing on the walls that stole his breath. Scrawled in what looked like dried blood were words, dozens of them repeated over and over in jagged, desperate handwriting. Stay out. Turn back. It's watching. At the center of it all was a name. His name. Owen Ashford. His knees went weak, and he had to brace himself against the doorframe to keep from collapsing. This couldn't be real. It didn't make sense. As he stared at the words, the mirror caught his eye. His reflection stared back at him, pale and wide-eyed, but there was something wrong. The room behind him was empty, but in the mirror, a figure stood just over his shoulder. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the swinging light. A shadow clung to it like a second skin, and its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as though its neck had been broken. Owen spun around, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The room was empty. When he turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone. He backed away, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. His phone vibrated in his hand, the sudden motion making him yelp. He fumbled with it, nearly dropping it again before managing to bring it to his ear. Hello? Static crackled on the other end, faint at first but growing louder. Beneath it, he thought he could hear voices, dozens of them overlapping in a chaotic symphony of whispers. Then, cutting through the noise like a knife. Asterisk, asterisk, get out, asterisk, asterisk. The line went dead. Owen stared at his phone, his fingers trembling so badly he could barely hold it. He didn't wait for another message. He bolted out of the room, his footsteps echoing loudly in the silent house. But as he reached the top of the stairs, he stopped short. The hallway below was gone. In its place was an endless stretch of darkness, yawning and infinite. The walls warped and twisted, the floorboards writhing like living things. And from the depths of that darkness, something was coming. Owen's breath came in short, shallow gasps as he stared into the black void that had swallowed the hallway. The house was no longer a house. It was alive, shifting, pulsating, as though some unseen force was rearranging its insides. The sound of footsteps echoed from the darkness below. Slow and deliberate, they moved with an unnatural rhythm, each step landing heavier than the last. Hello? Owen called out, his voice cracking with panic. No response, just the relentless approach of those steps. He took a step back, his heel brushing against the warped floorboards behind him. His pulse pounded in his ears, and the phone in his hand felt useless now, its feeble light barely penetrating the suffocating dark. And then he saw it. Emerging from the shadows was a figure. At first it seemed almost human, but as it stepped closer, the details became wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. The head lolled to one side, the neck bent at a grotesque angle, and its face, if it could even be called a face, was a pale, featureless expanse of skin. Owen stumbled back, his back hitting the wall behind him. Stay away, he shouted, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It tilted its head further, as if studying him, then took another step forward. And another. The hallway seemed to shrink around him, the walls pressing in, the air thick and suffocating. Desperation clawed at Owen's chest. He had to move. He had to get out. He turned and bolted toward the nearest door, wrenching it open without thinking. He stumbled inside and slammed it shut behind him, pressing his weight against it as if that would keep the thing out. The room was small and claustrophobic, with no furniture except for a single wooden chest in the corner. The air was colder here, each breath escaping his lips in visible puffs of mist. The walls were bare except for a single frame hanging crookedly. Inside the frame was a photograph, a black and white image of a family standing in front of the very house he was in. A man, a woman, and 2 children, all smiling stiffly at the camera. Owen moved closer, his eyes narrowing. Something about the picture wasn't right. The family looked normal enough, but their eyes were all wrong. Each one had been scratched out, leaving jagged tears in the photograph. And then, as he stared, the photograph began to change. The figures shifted subtly, their heads turning ever so slightly toward him. The scratches where their eyes should have been seemed to widen, bleeding darkness that oozed down the frame. He stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. A sound broke the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping. He turned toward the chest in the corner, his stomach twisting with dread. The tapping was coming from inside. No, he whispered to himself, shaking his head. No, no, no. But the tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it was a pounding that echoed in the tiny room. Driven by equal parts terror and morbid curiosity, he moved toward the chest. His hands shook as he reached for the lid, his mind screaming at him to stop. He lifted it. Inside was a doll. It was old and filthy, its porcelain face cracked and its once bright dress faded to a dull, sickly yellow. Its glass eyes stared blankly ahead, but as Owen leaned closer, they shifted. The doll blinked. Owen screamed, stumbling backward and knocking over the frame. The sound of shattering glass filled the air, and the room seemed to convulse around him, the walls groaning as though in pain. The door behind him rattled violently. He spun around just as it burst open, the faceless figure from the hallway lurching into the room. Its elongated arms reached for him, fingers twisting like the roots of a dead tree. Owen dove past it, skidding on the slick floor as he bolted back into the hallway. The light from his phone flickered wildly, illuminating the distorted world around him in brief, chaotic flashes. The house was collapsing in on itself, the walls bending and twisting like they were made of flesh. The floor beneath his feet undulated, making every step a fight to stay upright. He ran blindly, his only thought to escape. Behind him, the sound of pursuit grew louder, the heavy, uneven footsteps of the faceless figure, accompanied by the faint, high-pitched giggle of the doll. He didn't stop until he reached the stairs, but when he looked down, his stomach dropped. The void was still there, stretching endlessly below. A voice whispered in his ear, so close it felt like a breath on his neck. Jump. He spun around, but no one was there. The footsteps were closer now, the figure closing in, its shadow stretching long and jagged across the warped walls. Jump, the voice urged again, more insistent this time. Owen looked down at the void, then back at the approaching figure. There was no way out. Heart pounding, he closed his eyes and stepped forward. Owen fell into the blackness, the world around him dissolving into an icy, suffocating void. Wind rushed past him, though he couldn't tell if he was falling fast or suspended in endless freefall. There was no up, no down, only the cold grip of darkness pressing against his skin, wrapping around his throat and invading his mind. Then, with a bone-rattling thud, he hit solid ground. Pain shot through his limbs, forcing a groan from his lips as he rolled onto his side. His phone, miraculously still in his hand, cast a faint, flickering light over the ground beneath him. Dirt. Damp, cold earth pressed against his palms as he struggled to his knees. The air smelled of rot and mildew, thick and heavy like a swamp. When he raised his head, he saw it. A corridor stretching endlessly in both directions, its walls made of crumbling stone slick with moisture. The faint sound of dripping water echoed in the stillness, accompanied by a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to vibrate in his chest. "Where am I?" he muttered, his voice hoarse and trembling. The corridor offered no answer. He picked a direction and began to walk, his footsteps loud in the oppressive silence. The light from his phone illuminated the narrow passage, revealing strange markings etched into the stone walls. Symbols and runes that looked ancient, their jagged lines glowing faintly as he passed. The hum grew louder, resonating deep within him, as though the very walls were alive and pulsing with some unseen energy. Then came the whispers. They started softly, barely audible, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But as he moved deeper into the corridor, they grew louder, more distinct. Owen? His name carried on countless voices. Male, female, young, old, all speaking in unison, their tones devoid of emotion. He spun around, his phone's light trembling as he pointed it into the darkness behind him. Nothing. "Stop it," he shouted, his voice echoing down the corridor. "Leave me alone." The whispers fell silent. For a moment, all he could hear was his own ragged breathing. He turned back and froze. The corridor had changed. Where there had once been stone walls, there was now a series of doorways stretching endlessly into the distance. Each door was identical, made of dark, aged wood with tarnished brass handles. He approached the nearest one, his hand hesitating over the handle. Carved into the wood was a single word: regret. The word sent a shiver down his spine. His fingers brushed the handle, and a surge of cold shot through him, making him pull back. The whispers returned, louder now, and with them came images flashing through his mind. Memories he had buried deep, things he didn't want to face. A hospital room. The steady beep of a heart monitor. His mother's frail hand in his, her voice weak as she said, "Please stay a little longer." And his own voice, cold and distant. "I can't, Mom. I have to go." The memory stabbed at him like a knife, guilt bubbling up in his chest. He had left that day, convinced she would have more time. She didn't. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Regret. Owen? He backed away from the door, shaking his head. No, he whispered. I didn't mean to. Another door caught his eye. This one was marked guilt, and another, shame. They stretched on endlessly, each one bearing a word that seemed to claw at his soul. He began to run, the light from his phone bouncing wildly as he passed door after door. But no matter how far he ran, the corridor never ended. A sound behind him made him stop. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, the same uneven cadence he had heard in the house. He turned, his stomach twisting as he saw the figure emerging from the darkness. It was the same faceless creature, its long limbs contorting unnaturally as it moved toward him. Stay back, he shouted, raising his phone like a weapon. The figure didn't stop. Its head tilted as if mocking his fear, and it reached out with one impossibly long arm. In desperation, Owen flung open the nearest door and stepped inside. The air in the room was different, stale and suffocating, thick with the scent of decay. The door slammed shut behind him and the whispers ceased. He raised his phone, the dim light revealing a circular chamber. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with objects. Broken toys, faded photographs, pieces of jewelry. At the center of the room stood a table, and on it lay a single item. A photograph. He approached cautiously, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. The photo was of him as a child, no more than 6 or 7 years old. He was standing in a park, holding hands with a man who had been blurred out, his face smudged beyond recognition. Written across the bottom of the photograph in spidery handwriting were the words, "He remembers." A chill ran down Owen's spine. "Who?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The room answered with a low groan, the shelves rattling as if something massive had shifted beneath the floor. Before he could react, the photograph burst into flames, the fire consuming it in an instant without leaving so much as a trace of ash. The door behind him creaked open. Owen turned slowly, his heart pounding as he saw the faceless figure standing in the doorway, its head nearly scraping the top of the frame. "Run," it said in a voice that was not its own. It was his. Owen didn't hesitate. His legs moved before his brain could register the command, propelling him through the door and back into the endless corridor. The oppressive air clawed at his lungs, but fear was stronger than exhaustion. Behind him, the faceless figure stepped into the hallway, its footsteps steady and deliberate. "Run," it repeated in Owen's own voice, but this time, the single word echoed as if spoken by dozens of voices at once. Owen sprinted past door after door, the words carved into each one blurring together as his focus narrowed to survival. He tried not to think about the way the corridor seemed to shift beneath his feet, the walls rippling like the surface of a disturbed pond. Suddenly the corridor forked. 2 paths stretched ahead, identical in their endless, door-lined expanse. He hesitated, his chest heaving as he glanced over his shoulder. The figure was closer now, its elongated limbs brushing against the walls. "Choose," it said, its voice splitting into an eerie chorus. Without thinking, Owen veered left. The corridor tightened around him, the walls narrowing until his shoulders brushed against the cold, damp stone. The air was heavier here, and the hum that had been faint before now pulsed like a heartbeat, loud enough to drown out his own thoughts. Ahead, a door stood ajar. Unlike the others, this one was unmarked, its wood splintered and rotting. A faint, flickering light seeped through the crack. Owen slowed, his instincts screaming at him to keep running, to avoid whatever lay beyond that door. But the corridor behind him was darkening, the faint glow from his phone unable to penetrate the encroaching blackness. The whispers returned, louder now, their words unintelligible but filled with urgency. He stepped toward the door, his hand trembling as he pushed it open. Inside was a room unlike any he had seen before. The walls were made of mirrors, each one cracked and covered in a thin layer of grime. The floor was smooth, black, and impossibly reflective, giving the illusion that he was walking on a bottomless void. In the center of the room stood a chair, its back to him. A figure sat in it, slumped forward as though asleep or lifeless. "Hello?" Owen called, his voice echoing unnaturally in the mirrored space. The figure didn't move. He approached cautiously, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the room's oppressive silence. When he was close enough to see the figure clearly, his stomach dropped. It was him. The man in the chair was a perfect reflection of himself, down to the ragged clothes and the trembling phone in his hand. But where Owen's face was filled with fear, the figure's was blank, its eyes staring straight ahead. What is this?" he whispered. The reflection blinked. Owen stumbled back, his heel catching on the slick floor. As he fell, the mirrored walls around him came alive. Each mirror showed a different version of himself. In one he was much younger, standing in the hospital room with his mother. She was pleading with him, her eyes filled with tears, but he turned his back on her, walking out the door. In another he was older, his face gaunt and hollow. He stood alone in a cemetery, staring at a headstone with his mother's name etched into the granite. "Stop," Owen said, his voice breaking. "Stop showing me this." The mirrors ignored him, their images shifting faster now, each one displaying a different failure, a different regret. He saw himself yelling at an ex-girlfriend, slamming a door in her face. He saw himself ignoring calls from old friends, retreating further into his own loneliness. "Stop," he screamed, his voice echoing until it became a roar. The figure in the chair stood. Owen froze as his reflection turned to face him. Its movements were fluid but wrong, like a video playing at an unnatural speed. "You can't run," it said, its voice an exact copy of his own. I didn't mean for any of it to happen," Owen stammered, backing away. "I didn't know." "You knew," the reflection interrupted, stepping closer. Its face twisted, its features becoming sharper, more monstrous. "You chose." Owen turned to run, but the door was gone. The mirrors surrounded him now, closing in as the reflection followed, its footsteps unnaturally loud. "You can't run from yourself," it said, the voice warping into something guttural and inhuman. The mirrors shattered. Owen shielded his face as shards of glass rained down, slicing into his skin. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the corridor, sprawled on the cold, damp ground. The whispers were gone, but the hum persisted, a low vibration that seemed to seep into his very bones. He pushed himself to his feet, his limbs aching and his mind racing. The corridor was different now. The doors were gone, replaced by jagged openings in the stone walls, each one leading into impenetrable darkness. Ahead, a faint light flickered. He stumbled toward it, his steps unsteady. The light grew brighter, revealing another fork in the path. This time, one path was illuminated, glowing with a warm, golden light, while the other was shrouded in shadow. A voice echoed in his mind, soft and familiar. "Choose wisely." It wasn't the faceless figure's voice. It wasn't his own. It was his mother's. Tears welled in his eyes as he stepped toward the illuminated path, his heart aching with a mixture of hope and dread. The moment he crossed the threshold, the light vanished, plunging him into complete darkness. And then he heard it, a deep, guttural growl, so close it felt like it was coming from inside his own chest. The darkness shifted, and two glowing red eyes appeared, staring directly at him. The glowing red eyes pinned Owen in place, their intensity paralyzing. They were not merely eyes, they radiated malice, a searing heat that seemed to strip away layers of his sanity. He wanted to scream, but his throat tightened as though invisible hands had wrapped around it. The growl reverberated through the corridor, low and guttural, shaking the very ground beneath his feet. Then it stepped into the light. The creature was massive, its form humanoid but grotesquely distorted. Its body was covered in wiry black fur that seemed to shift and ripple like smoke. Long, clawed hands scraped against the walls as it moved closer, and its face was the most horrifying part. It was a twisted mirror of Owen's own, the features exaggerated and monstrous. Its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged, glistening teeth. "You cannot escape," it snarled, its voice a deep, distorted version of Owen's. Every instinct in him screamed to run, but his legs felt like lead. The creature's eyes burned into his soul, filling him with an overwhelming sense of dread and despair. "Who are you?" Owen managed to choke out, his voice barely audible. The creature tilted its head, a grotesque mockery of curiosity. "I am you," it said simply. "I am your shadow, your truth, your burden. You fed me with every lie, every betrayal, every regret." Owen shook his head, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "You're not real. I'm dreaming. This isn't real." The creature laughed, a sound so chilling it made his skin crawl. "Reality is what you make of it," it said, stepping closer. Its claws gleamed in the dim light. "And you have made a prison of your mind." Owen stumbled backward, the oppressive walls of the corridor pressing against him. The creature didn't rush. It moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to go. In desperation, Owen turned and ran. The corridor stretched endlessly, the hum growing louder with each step. The walls pulsed like living flesh, and the air grew thicker, heavier, as though the darkness itself was trying to suffocate him. But the creature was relentless. Its footsteps echoed behind him, slow and steady, yet always closer than they should have been. Ahead, a faint light appeared, a doorway, glowing faintly in the suffocating darkness. Owen pushed himself harder, his legs screaming in protest as he sprinted toward it. The whispers returned, louder now, their voices overlapping in a chaotic cacophony. Don't stop. It's a trap. Run faster. Turn back. Owen ignored them, focusing only on the light. He reached the door and threw it open, collapsing inside. The door slammed shut behind him, cutting off the whispers and plunging him into silence. The room was small, barely more than a closet, its walls lined with jagged, uneven stones. A single object sat in the center of the room, a mirror, ancient and ornate, its silver frame tarnished with age. The surface of the mirror was dark, reflecting nothing. Owen crawled toward it, his body trembling. The hum was louder here, vibrating through the floor and into his bones. As he stared into the mirror, the surface began to change. Shapes emerged from the darkness, faint at first, then clearer, until he was staring at his own reflection. But it wasn't him. The version of himself in the mirror was smiling, a cruel, twisted grin that didn't reach its eyes. Its lips moved, forming words that Owen couldn't hear. What do you want?" he whispered. The reflection's grin widened. Its eyes glowed red, just like the creature's. "I want you to see," it said, its voice echoing in his mind. Images flashed across the mirror's surface, each one more horrifying than the last. He saw the hospital room again, his mother's face etched with pain and disappointment. He saw the empty bottles littering his apartment, the unanswered phone calls from people he had pushed away. He saw the faces of friends and lovers, their expressions twisted with anger and betrayal. "You can't run from this," the reflection said, its voice soft but unyielding. "You carry it with you. Always." Owen shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't mean for any of it to happen. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." The reflection laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Intent doesn't matter. Only the consequences." The room began to tremble, the walls cracking as the hum grew deafening. The mirror's surface rippled and the reflection stepped out. It was no longer confined to the glass. The doppelganger stood before him, identical in every way except for the glowing red eyes and the malevolent grin. "You can't escape what you are," it said, advancing on him. "But you can face it." Owen scrambled back, his hands clawing at the uneven floor. "What do you mean? Face what?" The doppelganger crouched, its grin fading into a solemn expression. "Your truth," it said. "The truth you've buried under lies and excuses. The truth you've run from all your life." Owen shook his head violently. "No, I won't. I can't." The doppelganger reached out, its hand hovering over Owen's chest. "You must," it said, its voice now softer, almost compassionate. "Or the shadows will consume you." The room erupted in light, blinding and searing. Owen screamed as the light engulfed him, burning away the darkness, the whispers, and the suffocating weight of the corridor. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on the cold, damp floor of the original corridor. The creature was gone. The doppelganger was gone. But the hum remained, quieter now, like a distant heartbeat. He struggled to his feet, his body trembling. Ahead, the corridor stretched on, endless and dark. But this time, he noticed something he hadn't before. Faint etchings on the walls, words that glowed softly in the gloom. To face the shadows, one must walk through the light. Owen took a deep, shuddering breath and began to walk. Owen moved forward, the words etched into the walls glowing faintly with each step he took. They pulsed like a weak heartbeat, a faint reminder that he was not entirely alone in the suffocating darkness. The corridor was quieter now, the oppressive hum having faded to a dull thrum. But the silence that replaced it was unnerving, as if the very air held its breath. He tried not to think about the creature or the doppelganger. The visions in the mirror still haunted him, replaying in his mind like a broken record. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus on the path ahead. The corridor opened into a vast chamber, its size hidden in shadows. A faint glow illuminated the center of the room, where a cluster of objects lay scattered on the ground. Owen hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to stay back. But something about the objects drew him in, an unnatural pull like a thread winding around his chest and tugging him forward. As he stepped into the chamber, the glow intensified, revealing the objects more clearly. There were photographs, yellowed and curling at the edges. There were toys, rusted and broken, their shapes barely discernible. There were letters, their ink faded but still legible if he squinted. Owen crouched, picking up a photograph. The image was of a child, no older than 6, standing in front of a decrepit house. The child's face was partially obscured, but their posture radiated fear. The back of the photograph was scribbled with a single word, "Gone." A chill ran down his spine. He set the photograph aside and picked up one of the letters. The paper crumbled slightly under his fingers as he unfolded it. "Dearest Clara, they said we shouldn't stay, but I couldn't leave you. You're here in this house, in the walls, in the whispers. They don't understand. They think it's madness. But I hear you, my love. I feel you. I'll stay until they take me too. Forever yours, Joseph." Owen's heart pounded in his chest. He dropped the letter, his hands trembling. The glow from the objects grew brighter, and the room seemed to close in around him. Shadows crept along the walls, their movements fluid and unnatural. And then the whispers began again. This time the whispers weren't chaotic. They were deliberate, rhythmic, like a chant. Lost, forgotten, taken. Owen turned in a circle, his eyes scanning the room. The shadows moved with purpose now, coalescing into forms at the edges of the chamber. Figures began to emerge from the darkness, pale, translucent shapes that flickered like dying flames. They were children, their eyes hollow, their mouths twisted in silent screams. Owen stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. Who are you?" he stammered. The figures didn't respond. Instead, they moved closer, their forms flickering and shifting. They weren't solid, but their presence was heavy, pressing down on him like a physical weight. One of the children stepped forward, a girl with long matted hair and a dress that seemed to drip with shadow. Her eyes were empty sockets, but Owen could feel her gaze piercing through him. "Help us," she whispered, her voice echoing like 1,000 others layered beneath it. Owen swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I don't understand. Help you how?" The girl tilted her head, her movements jerky and unnatural. "You must remember." "Remember what?" he asked, his voice rising in panic. The other figures joined the chant, their voices merging into a deafening roar. "Remember, remember, remember." Owen clutched his head, the sound drilling into his skull. Images flashed through his mind, fragmented, disjointed memories that didn't feel like his own. A woman crying in the dark. A child's laughter turning into screams. A door slamming shut, locking out the light. And then he saw it, the house from the photograph. Its windows glowed faintly, like eyes staring back at him. He gasped, the vision shattering as the room plunged into silence. The girl was inches from his face now, her hollow eyes unblinking. "You've been here before," she said, her voice a low hiss. "You left us." Owen shook his head violently. "No, I haven't. I don't know this place. I don't know you." The girl raised a hand, her fingers skeletal and dripping with black ichor. She pressed her palm to his forehead. Pain exploded in his skull, a blinding white light that consumed everything. He saw himself as a child, standing in the middle of the same corridor. His mother was there, her face pale and gaunt. She was holding his hand, her grip tight enough to hurt. "Don't look back," she whispered, her voice trembling. They were running. Doors slammed shut behind them, the corridor groaning as if alive. Owen tried to turn, but his mother yanked him forward. "Keep going," she screamed, and then she was gone. The vision ended as abruptly as it had begun. Owen collapsed to the ground, his body shaking. The girl stood over him, her form flickering like a dying flame. "You left," she said, her voice filled with quiet accusation. Tears streamed down his face. I was just a kid. I didn't know." The figures began to retreat, their translucent forms blending into the darkness. The girl lingered for a moment longer, her hollow eyes fixed on him. "Remember," she whispered, her voice echoing faintly as she dissolved into shadow. The glow from the objects faded, leaving the chamber in total darkness. Owen sat there for what felt like hours, his mind reeling. The memory felt real, but it didn't make sense. He had no recollection of this place, no memory of running through its corridors with his mother. But deep down, something stirred, a buried truth clawing its way to the surface. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady. Ahead, a faint light appeared, marking the way forward. With a deep, shuddering breath, he began to walk again, the whispers of the forgotten ones echoing faintly behind him. The faint light ahead seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, calling to Owen like a distant heartbeat. Each step felt heavier, as though the shadows pressing in around him were trying to hold him back. The air grew colder, biting at his skin, but he forced himself onward. As he approached the light, he realized it wasn't coming from an ordinary source. A massive, ornate doorway stood before him, carved into the stone wall. Its surface was covered in intricate symbols, circles, lines, and jagged shapes that seemed to writhe and shift when he looked at them directly. The glow emanated from these carvings, their light faint but unrelenting. Owen hesitated, his hand hovering just inches from the door. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. His pulse thundered in his ears, his breath visible in the freezing air. He pressed his palm against the door. The carvings flared to life, their glow intensifying as the symbols began to shift and rearrange. The door groaned, its ancient hinges creaking as it slowly swung inward. Beyond the threshold was a vast chamber, unlike anything Owen had seen before. The walls were covered in the same shifting symbols, their light casting eerie shadows that danced across the room. In the center stood an altar, its surface stained with dark, dried smears. Suspended above the altar was a massive book, its cover bound in a material that looked disturbingly like flesh. Chains of glowing light held it in place, each link pulsating with energy. Owen's stomach turned at the sight of the book, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. It felt alive, as though it were watching him, waiting for him to draw closer. The hum returned, louder than ever, vibrating through his chest and rattling his teeth. As Owen stepped into the chamber, the door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing like a gunshot. He spun around, his heart racing, but there was no handle, no way back. Forward, he muttered to himself, his voice shaky. Just keep going. He approached the altar, each step feeling like a monumental effort. The air grew heavier, pressing down on him as though the chamber itself resented his presence. When he was just a few feet away, the hum stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural voice. You should not have come. Owen froze. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating off the walls and filling the chamber. I didn't mean to, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't even know how I got here. The voice laughed, a deep, hollow sound that sent chills down his spine. You were called, it said. Drawn back to the place where it all began. Owen's hands trembled as he gestured toward the book. What is that? What's happening to me? The voice didn't answer immediately. Instead, the chains binding the book began to pulse, their light growing brighter. The book shifted, the flesh-like cover twitching as though alive. It is the source, the voice finally said. The binding of your guilt, your fear, your pain. It is what holds this place together. Owen shook his head, his mind racing. I don't understand. Why me? What does this have to do with me? The symbols on the walls flared, their light blinding. The chamber seemed to shift, the floor tilting beneath him. He stumbled, falling to his knees as the voice grew louder. Because you left, it boomed. You abandoned what was yours to bear. And now, it calls you back to finish what you started. The memories came rushing back in fragments. His mother's pale face, her trembling hands as she pushed him forward. The sound of the door slamming shut behind him. The sense of overwhelming dread as he fled, leaving her behind. Owen's chest tightened. No, he whispered. I didn't leave her. She told me to run. She told you to survive, the voice interrupted. And in doing so, you bound her here. Her pain, her fear, they became the foundation of this place. And now it feeds on you. Tears streamed down Owen's face as he looked at the book. How do I stop it? How do I fix this? The voice grew quieter, almost contemplative. You must break the binding. But doing so comes with a cost. What cost? Owen demanded, his voice breaking. The chains pulsed one final time before shattering, the glowing links dissolving into the air. The book fell to the altar with a sickening thud, its cover rippling like water. You must face what you have tried to forget, the voice said. The truth that you buried to save yourself. Owen approached the altar, his hands trembling as he reached for the book. The flesh-like cover was warm under his fingers, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. He opened it. The pages were filled with symbols at first, the same shifting, writhing shapes that covered the walls. But as he turned the pages, they began to change, forming words that he could understand. Each page told a story, a memory, a moment from his life that he had tried to bury. The fights with his mother, the nights spent drowning his sorrows in alcohol, the relationships he had sabotaged out of fear and guilt. And then came the final page. It showed the moment he had tried to forget. His mother, standing in the corridor, her back to him as the door slammed shut between them. Her voice echoed in his mind, not the panicked scream he remembered but a calm, resigned whisper. Forgive me, Owen. The page began to burn, the flames spreading quickly. The book disintegrated in his hands, the ashes swirling around him. The chamber shook violently, the symbols on the walls flashing erratically. The voice returned, louder and more commanding than ever. Now you must choose, take her place or let it all crumble. Owen stared at the altar, his mind racing. The weight of his mother's sacrifice, his own guilt, and the horrific reality of the situation pressed down on him. "What happens if I let it crumble?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The voice hesitated before answering. "The shadows will be freed. They will spread, consuming all in their path. You would doom others to the fate you escaped." Owen's hands clenched into fists. He had spent his life running from his pain, his guilt, and his past. But now, faced with the weight of his choices, he couldn't run any longer. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady. "I'll take her place." The altar began to glow, the light consuming the room. The symbols faded, replaced by an overwhelming sense of peace. As the light engulfed him, Owen felt the weight of his guilt lifting. He closed his eyes, a single tear sliding down his cheek. When he opened them, the chamber was gone. He stood in the corridor again, but it was different now. The walls were clean, the air fresh, and the oppressive darkness had lifted. But he wasn't alone. A figure stood at the end of the corridor, her face hidden in shadow. As she stepped forward, the light revealed his mother, her expression soft and serene. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with love and gratitude. Owen reached out to her, but she shook her head. "This is your journey now," she said. "Find peace, my son. And remember, you are stronger than the shadows." She faded into the light, leaving Owen alone. The air outside felt different, lighter, as if the weight of years had been lifted from Owen's chest. He stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the house, his childhood home. The same house from his nightmares, from the memories that had tormented him for so long. It was quiet now, peaceful even, the shadows that had once loomed over it no longer as heavy. The forest around him seemed to hum with life, the stillness of the previous days replaced with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. The fog that had once suffocated the air had dissipated, and the oppressive chill was gone. But something lingered. Owen glanced back over his shoulder. The road that led him to this place was empty, the way ahead unmarked. There was no sign of the dark entity, no presence of the children's whispers. And yet, there was a faint sense of something waiting, something unresolved. His fingers twitched at his sides. He hadn't truly understood the full extent of the sacrifice he'd made, hadn't grasped the weight of what he had chosen. To take her place had seemed like the only way to end the torment, to free himself from the nightmare. But as he stood there, staring at the now empty house, the feeling that he hadn't quite escaped it all began to settle in. He turned back to the house, stepping toward it cautiously. The front door stood ajar, a faint golden light spilling from within as though inviting him in. He could almost hear his mother's voice, soft and comforting, calling him forward. "Come inside, Owen." The voice was almost too real, as if she were standing just beyond the threshold, waiting for him. He hesitated. Was this some trick? A final attempt to drag him back into the depths of his guilt? Or had she truly been freed, her spirit finally at rest? Taking a breath, Owen pushed the door open fully. The interior of the house was unchanged. The same worn furniture, the same faded wallpaper, the same familiar scent of dust and old wood. But as Owen stepped inside, something felt off, like the shadows in the corners of the room were watching him. The house was too still, too quiet. He walked deeper into the hallway, the floorboards creaking under his feet. The walls seemed to close in around him, the once welcoming home now oppressive, like a tomb. And then he saw it, the mirror standing at the end of the hall. It wasn't large, but it was unmistakable. The same mirror that had haunted him earlier, the one that showed him the twisted reflection of himself. He took a step toward it, his breath shallow. As he neared, the glass rippled like water, the surface warping before him. In the reflection there was something new. His mother stood in the doorway behind him, smiling softly. But there was a darkness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The warmth of her expression was gone, replaced by something colder, emptier. Her form flickered, a shadow caught between two worlds. Owen spun around, but the hallway was empty. "Mom?" he called out, his voice trembling. But there was no answer. He turned back to the mirror. This time, his own reflection was different. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, like he had aged years in the span of moments. And his hands, he stared at them, the once familiar skin now mottled with dark veins, as though he were withering away from the inside out. The voice returned. "You've taken what you didn't understand, Owen," it whispered, the same guttural tone he'd heard before. "You cannot escape it." Owen stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. "What are you talking about? What did I do?" The figure in the mirror smiled, a grotesque twist of its lips. "You left her once, and now you'll leave her again. But this time there is no return. The binding is complete." The room began to spin, the walls warping and shifting as the mirror's surface began to ripple, swallowing him whole. The house distorted, bending and twisting like a funhouse, until Owen could no longer tell what was real. He stumbled back, falling to the ground as the floor seemed to collapse beneath him. The mirror shattered. Suddenly, Owen was back in the chamber. The altar loomed before him once again, its stained surface glistening with the remnants of some unholy ritual. The book, the flesh-bound tome, was there too, its pages fluttering in an unseen wind. He was back where it had all begun. But the air was different now. Charged. Heavy. A shadow moved at the edge of his vision. Owen, the voice whispered, this time filled with a cruel mockery. You think you can outrun the past, but it's here waiting. You can never truly escape. Owen's legs shook as he stood, his chest tightening with the weight of realization. The house, the altar, the mirror, it was all part of the same cycle. He had thought he was free. He had believed the choice he made had freed him from the shadows. But the truth was darker than he had imagined. He wasn't just bound by his guilt. He was bound to this place, and it was hungry. The shadow moved again, closer this time, its form indistinct but full of malevolent intent. Owen's breath came in shallow gasps. He had no escape, no answers, and yet he could feel the pull of the darkness, pulling him back to where it had all started. Please, he whispered, his voice trembling. I did what you wanted. I took her place. No, the voice interrupted, its laughter rising around him, thick with derision. You took her place because you had no other choice. And now you will pay the price. The shadow loomed above him, its cold presence suffocating. Owen's legs buckled beneath him, but he refused to fall. He fought the urge to sink into the darkness, to let the weight of it drag him under. He couldn't let it end like this. Not again. I won't be your pawn, he said, the words coming out hoarse. I won't let you take me again. The shadow paused. A flicker of uncertainty passed through it. You are already ours, the voice hissed, its tone filled with cold finality. The chamber began to shake, the ground trembling beneath Owen's feet. The shadows reached out toward him, wrapping around his legs, his arms, his chest. He could feel them pulling, dragging him into the depths. But just as his body began to give in, the memory of his mother surged through him. Her voice, her love, her sacrifice. He had made a choice before. He could make another now. With all the strength he could muster, Owen pulled himself free of the shadow's grip, pushing them back with everything he had. The darkness recoiled, but it was relentless. I will not be your victim, he screamed. I will break free. The room shuddered, the mirror cracking as if responding to his will. Light began to pour into the space, cutting through the shadows like a blade. The chamber was dissolving, the walls crumbling around him. Owen didn't know if he had won. But as the light engulfed him, he knew one thing for certain. He would never stop fighting. Owen awoke on cold stone, his body bruised and aching, but the sensation of the darkness pulling at him was gone. The light that had engulfed him seemed to have faded, and now he lay alone in a vast, empty space. The familiar echo of his breathing was the only sound in the silence. The world around him felt wrong. His hands scraped against the cold surface beneath him, and when he forced himself to stand, he realized he was no longer in the chamber. There was no altar, no flickering shadows. The air was thick and his senses felt dulled. He was somewhere else, a place that felt hollow. He looked around. The world stretched endlessly before him, an empty expanse of barren land, the horizon a smudged line of darkness against a pale, overcast sky. Where am I? The thought sent a ripple of panic through him. This wasn't the house, not the chamber either. This place was cold, desolate, as though something essential was missing. He stumbled forward, his feet sinking slightly into the dust-like ground. He had no idea which direction to go. Every turn led to the same grayness, the same emptiness. But something tugged at him, an undeniable pull toward the horizon. The wind whispered faintly, but the voices were not comforting. They were hollow, like fragments of people who had once lived but were long since forgotten. They whispered in a language Owen didn't understand, their tones haunting and mournful. Owen had to move. The silence was worse than the shadow. The stillness threatened to suffocate him. As he walked, the land shifted. The ground began to slope downward, and soon he was descending into a valley. The shadows that had once consumed him now seemed to stretch across the land like a blanket, darker and heavier with each step he took. The fog, thicker now, swirling in uneven clouds, obscured his vision. It was as though the earth itself was pulling him toward a single point, drawing him deeper into this cold void. The wind picked up, carrying faint whispers again. They were too distant, too low to understand. but something in the cadence of the voices sounded familiar. It took him several moments before he realized what it was. They were his mother's words, or at least, words that echoed what she had said to him before. Asterisk, you are not finished? Asterisk. He froze. The phrase struck him like a physical blow. His heart pounded as he fought to control the sudden wave of dread that threatened to overwhelm him. Asterisk, you are not finished? Asterisk. His mother's voice, or the echo of it, reverberated in his mind again, and he realized that the deeper he went into this void, the more oppressive the air became. It wasn't just the wind now, it was a weight, an unbearable heaviness pressing against his chest, squeezing the breath from his lungs. His mind raced. What was this place? Why did it feel like he was being drawn into the very core of his guilt? The land itself seemed to be a manifestation of everything he had buried. His regret, his fear, his inability to face the truth. As he continued, the path wound downward, twisting and turning, until he reached a clearing. At the center of the clearing was a tree. It was nothing like the trees he had seen before. This one was dark, its bark blackened and twisted, its limbs hanging like broken fingers reaching out toward him. The air around it was thicker, as if the tree itself exhaled a toxic fog that clung to the air. Owen approached it cautiously, unsure of what he was meant to do. The whispers grew louder, echoing around him, and then, the ground trembled beneath him. The tree's twisted roots shifted, parting to reveal a stone door at the base of the tree. The door looked old, ancient, and its surface was covered with strange symbols. Some of the symbols glowed faintly, like embers fading out. Without thinking, Owen reached out, his hand brushing the door's surface. The instant his fingers made contact, a deep rumble filled the air, and the tree seemed to breathe. The door creaked open on its own, revealing nothing but a dark void beyond it. An overwhelming sense of dread washed over Owen. He had never been more certain that something terrible waited on the other side. But something also urged him forward, a pull stronger than his fear. Owen stepped through the door. The world on the other side was even darker than the one he had just left. The air was still and thick, and yet there was a sense of movement, something watching him from the shadows. He tried to call out, but his voice was swallowed up by the void. He couldn't tell if the silence was oppressive or if he had lost the ability to hear it all. He had entered a room, a large chamber, though its size was hard to gauge in the dimness. He could just make out the outlines of walls, but they seemed to bend and stretch unnaturally, warping and changing when he tried to focus on them. Suddenly, a low laugh echoed through the space. It was cold and disembodied, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Owen's heart clenched. "You thought you were finished, didn't you?" The voice crooned, dragging its words slowly, savoring each syllable. "Who are you?" Owen demanded, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to stay steady. A shadow shifted in the corner of his vision, and then, before he could react, something moved behind him. The sound of footsteps echoed, the heavy thud of something approaching. Owen spun around, his breath catching in his throat. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was human, or at least it appeared to be, but it was wrong. The shape was warped, its limbs stretching and bending at unnatural angles. Its face was a blur, constantly shifting like the reflection in a cracked mirror. It moved toward him, a grotesque parody of a person. Owen's mind screamed at him to run, but his feet were frozen to the ground. "You can't escape," the figure whispered, its voice a cold, mocking rasp. "You were never meant to escape." Owen felt the air around him grow thick, the pressure closing in on him. The figure reached out with elongated hands, its fingers impossibly long. The shadows seemed to shift in response, swirling around it, enclosing him in a dark cocoon. "This is the end," the figure hissed, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. In that moment, Owen understood. This wasn't just another layer of the world he was in. It wasn't just another trap. It was something deeper, something tied to him. The shadows had followed him, bound him to this place. This was his undoing, his final reckoning. The figure reached out, its fingers brushing against his face. It felt cold, freezing, like ice sinking into his skin. Owen felt his body stiffen, his limbs going numb. But his mind screamed. "No," he cried, fighting to break free of the figure's touch. "I will not be your puppet. I won't be bound anymore." For the first time, the shadows recoiled. The figure faltered, its form distorting as if it were unraveling. And then, with a deafening roar, the shadows cracked open, the figure screaming as it tore itself apart. Owen fell to his knees, gasping for air, his mind reeling. The chamber around him began to dissolve, the walls melting into nothingness. The fog lifted and the whispers faded. He was alone again. But this time he wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse. The silence that followed was deafening. Owen sat on the ground, his head spinning as the last remnants of the strange, shifting chamber evaporated into nothingness. The weight of the void, the empty space that had threatened to consume him, seemed to dissolve with it. The air had lightened, but it still felt wrong, as if the world had been stretched thin, like a fabric that had been pulled too tightly. He rubbed his face, his hands trembling. Every part of him felt hollow, as if something essential had been carved out. His body was aching from the brutal journey, and his mind felt like it was unraveling at the edges, each thought slipping away into a sea of confusion. He had been tested in ways he couldn't explain. And yet, despite the overwhelming weight of exhaustion, there was something else. A nagging, gnawing feeling that he wasn't finished, that he was still not free. He stood slowly, his legs unsteady as though he had not used them in years. Looking around, the emptiness seemed to stretch endlessly before him, offering no answers. The ground beneath him, still thick with dust, felt less like earth and more like the remnants of something dead. The same whispers, faint and fragmented, floated on the edge of his hearing. They were indistinct, but their presence was undeniable. They weren't just sounds, they were echoes of people who had lived here long before him, trapped in this unrelenting place. The fog still clung to the air, thick and damp, swirling like an uninvited guest. But what had once felt oppressive now felt comforting. The fog was a blanket, hiding the vastness of the emptiness, suffocating the desolation just enough to give him something familiar to hold on to. Owen took a deep breath, the air cool in his lungs. He had to keep moving. He couldn't stay here. This wasn't the end. He could feel it deep within his bones. There was something still left unfinished. As he walked forward, the ground beneath him began to shift, the once stable path now crumbling, as though the earth itself was rejecting his presence. With each step, cracks spread across the dirt, widening as though the world was starting to break apart, piece by piece. He stumbled, catching himself on a jagged rock jutting from the ground, his hands scraping across its sharp surface. Blood dripped onto the earth, a stark contrast to the monochromatic landscape. The sky above darkened, heavy clouds swirling into a roiling mass, the kind of storm that didn't belong in this strange liminal space. It wasn't natural. It wasn't real. As the storm began to gather intensity, Owen felt it, the pull, a deeper force than anything he had encountered before. The whispers escalated, growing louder, more frantic, their meaning now clear. He wasn't meant to leave. There were voices here, trapped voices. Voices that had once lived in the house, in the town, voices that had been consumed by whatever force had twisted this place into its current form. They were the remnants of those who had been taken by the house. And now they were speaking to him, begging him. Owen, a voice whispered, soft and insistent. You left us behind. The words sent a chill down his spine, as if the very air around him had turned to ice. He jerked his head around, searching for the source, but there was nothing but swirling fog and darkness. No, he murmured under his breath. I didn't leave anyone behind. But the voice came again, this time louder, filled with pain and accusation. You left us, Owen's heart pounded, the weight of the words sinking into his chest like a boulder. He had no memory of leaving anyone behind. But the more he thought about it, the more fragments of a past he couldn't fully recall began to surface. Faces, names, places he had forgotten. Suddenly, the fog seemed to thicken around him, pressing in from all sides. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that Owen's breath became visible, hanging in front of him like smoke. He could no longer tell where the ground ended and the sky began, the landscape blurring into an inky blackness. He stumbled, clutching at his chest, struggling to breathe. Was this another layer of the nightmare? Was this the final test, the thing that would break him? A flash of light. The lightning struck so suddenly that Owen barely had time to register it before the thunder cracked through the air, deafening and violent. His vision was blurred, but through the fog he saw something, a figure standing just ahead of him. It was tall, indistinct, its shape almost lost in the storm's fury. For a moment the world seemed to pause. The howling wind ceased and everything was still. The figure was waiting for him, its presence both familiar and foreign, something he couldn't quite place. The figure stepped forward, the sound of its footsteps muffled by the storm. Owen could see its outline now, clearer, an older man or something that resembled one. His face was hidden in shadow, his body draped in tattered clothes, his movements slow and deliberate. He seemed like a figure from another time, someone who had walked these lands long before Owen had ever set foot here. You're lost, the figure said, his voice like the crackling of dry leaves in an autumn wind. Lost in your own mind? Owen took a step back, his legs shaking beneath him. The storm raged again, but the figure didn't seem affected. His voice, calm and unervingly steady, cut through the chaos. You can't escape the house, Owen. It's in you. It's always been in you. A wave of nausea hit Owen, his knees buckling as the world around him seemed to spin uncontrollably. His head pounded with the weight of the words, the voice echoing in his ears. No, he gasped, clutching at his temples. I was free. I chose to free her. You freed nothing, the figure replied. You never understood. You still don't. The storm surged again, but this time the figure was gone. Vanished. And then Owen realized. The storm wasn't just a physical storm. It was the storm within him, the endless turmoil he had never allowed himself to face. The dark thoughts, the guilt, the fear that had followed him every step of the way. And now it was closing in on him again. His heart raced as he stood frozen in the middle of the chaos, the whispers rising around him, the wind howling through the expanse. He couldn't escape it. Not the storm, not the house, not his past. He was trapped in this never-ending cycle of torment, bound to the land that had twisted him into what he was now. A voice called his name, his mother's voice, soft and full of sorrow. And he realized the truth. There was no escaping the cycle. Not now. Not ever. This was his fate. To remain lost forever. Owen stood motionless in the middle of the storm, his body battered by the wind, his mind scrambling to make sense of the reality around him. The figure, the voice, his mother's call, all of it had been leading him to this moment. It had all been building to this, the final revelation, the inevitable end of his journey. But even now, as the storm swirled around him, he could not fully accept it. He could not let go. He wanted to believe that there was a way out, that he had more power than this place, more strength than the shadows that clung to him like a disease. But as the cold winds howled louder and the whispers turned into a cacophony, he realized the awful truth. There was no escape. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest tight with fear and disbelief. Everything he had gone through, all the horrors and the twists, the chamber, the tree, the endless void, all of it had been preparing him for the final moment. This place, this storm, it wasn't a test. It was a reckoning. A voice whispered again, his mother's voice, but this time it was different. It wasn't full of sorrow. It wasn't full of anger or regret. It was cold, calculating, resigned. Asterisk, you should have known, Owen. Asterisk. The words hit him like a blow to the chest. They shook him to his very core. The storm paused, the wind stilling, the fog rolling away, and for a brief moment, the ground beneath him solidified. The world was still silent. And then the figure appeared again, this time clearer, closer. The dark figure from before, the one that had spoken of his guilt and his past, now stood at the edge of the clearing. His face was shadowed still, but Owen could see the outline of his eyes, burning with a hollow intensity as if they were not eyes at all, but the very void itself. You thought you could outrun it, the figure said, his voice resonating deep within Owen's chest. But you can never outrun your own mind. Owen's heart raced, but he knew now that there was nothing to fear. Not from the storm, not from the figure, not from the past that had tormented him. Because it had all been a part of him. It always had been. You're just like me, the figure continued, stepping forward, his form now more solid, more defined. Bound to the same fate, the same curse. You thought you were different, but in the end we're all the same. The figure reached out, his hand outstretched, and Owen realized in that moment that the figure wasn't an enemy. It wasn't a creature to be destroyed. It was the manifestation of everything he had been running from. His fear, his guilt, his inability to face what he had done, what he had failed to do. Owen didn't resist as the figure's hand touched his shoulder. Instead, he closed his eyes and breathed deeply as if he were surrendering. The storm erupted again, the wind howling like a living thing, the ground trembling beneath him. But now Owen felt no fear. There was no dread. The whispers of the past, the voices of the lost, the shadows that had plagued him, began to fade into the distance, their power diminishing with each passing moment. He was done running. The figure spoke once more, but this time, there was no mockery in its tone. No anger. Only understanding. You are free, Owen. Not from the place. Not from the house. But from the cycle. The words seemed to resonate within him, echoing through his mind, filling the empty spaces where fear had once resided. He understood now. This wasn't about escaping the house or the storm or even the place he had once feared. It was about facing it. Facing the truth of who he was. The wind grew softer, the fog lifting completely, revealing the vast, empty landscape once more. The ground was still cracked, the sky still heavy, but Owen felt something different now. Something that had been missing before. He had reached the end. Not the end of the road, not the end of his life, but the end of his torment. The end of the lie he had been telling himself, that he could escape what he had become. As the storm subsided and the silence returned, Owen realized something else, that the place was not his prison. Not anymore. The house, the darkness, the storm, they were reflections of him. They were the remnants of his past, of his choices, of his inability to let go. But now that he had faced them, he felt lighter. The weight of the world, of the years of running, was lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in what felt like forever, Owen smiled. But even as the storm passed and the fog faded, the ground beneath his feet remained cracked, the world still fractured. The house, the place he had left behind, was still out there. And so, as Owen took a single step forward, he understood the truth. This was not the end. The cycle was broken, but the haunting would continue. Because in the end, the house was never the problem. It was him. And so, as the horizon darkened again, as the shadows stretched long and the air grew thick with the scent of rain, Owen walked forward, toward the next step, toward whatever waited for him next. He was free, yes, but the haunting never truly ends. The whispers returned one last time, faint and fading, but with the echo of finality. Asterisk, you are not finished. Asterisk. The wind howled like a living thing, a bitter and mournful wail that seemed to seep through the very walls of the house. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy clouds rolling in from the distance, and a thunderstorm threatened, darkening the small town below. The only road leading in was lined with towering trees that leaned in like sentinels. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, of something ancient, something forgotten. For Eleanor Marks, this was the last place she thought she would end up. Her car rolled to a stop in front of the old house, a relic from another time. Its wood was faded, peeling under the weight of years, and its windows stared blankly back at her like eyes that had seen too much. The address had been a last-minute booking, a quiet retreat in the countryside to escape the noise of her life, a chance to forget the things she never wanted to think about again. But now that she was here, she wasn't so sure anymore. Eleanor grabbed her suitcase and stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching underfoot. Her breath came out in small clouds as the temperature dropped, and she shivered despite the thick coat around her shoulders. She glanced over her shoulder toward the car's headlights, the only light cutting through the growing fog that swirled at her feet. The house loomed larger as she approached, its front door cracked open as if it had been expecting her. There was no one to greet her, no welcome signs. It felt wrong, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled, and for a moment she thought she saw something move in the shadows of the second-story window, a fleeting figure, or perhaps just a trick of the light. But it was gone before she could be certain. Inside, the house was cold and smelled of mildew and dust. It had the feel of something that hadn't been lived in for a long time, though the furniture appeared oddly undisturbed. The wooden floors creaked under her weight as she stepped deeper into the entryway. A chandelier hung overhead, its crystals long gone, leaving only rusted hooks and bare wires. The silence was overwhelming. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "Hello?" Eleanor called, her voice unsure, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the house. No answer. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. The wallpaper, once a rich floral print, now hung in tatters, peeling away to reveal the plaster beneath. Eleanor shivered, half from the cold, half from an inexplicable unease. She set her suitcase down by the stairs, noting the old key that lay beside it, tied to a string and dangling like a forgotten relic of some distant time. She picked it up and examined it in the pale light. The engraving on the brass was faint, worn by years of use, but it was still legible. A symbol she didn't recognize, perhaps something from an era long since past. A soft creak echoed from above. Eleanor froze. The sound was unmistakable, the shifting of floorboards as if someone was moving upstairs. "Is anyone here?" she asked again, louder this time. But again there was no response. The feeling of being watched settled over her like a heavy cloak. She took the key and moved toward the narrow staircase, her footsteps muffled on the thick carpet. The air was heavier here, charged with an oppressive energy, as if the house itself were holding its breath. At the top of the stairs, a narrow hallway stretched out before her, lined with closed doors. The wooden floor was warped and groaned underfoot, and every sound seemed to reverberate through the stillness. She reached for the nearest door, but her fingers paused just above the handle. There was something unsettling about it, a feeling that surged from deep within her, pushing her to step back. She shook her head, trying to clear the thoughts that were creeping into her mind. Her gaze flickered to the end of the hallway. There, beyond the darkened doorways, was a faint light. A soft, flickering glow that seemed to beckon her forward. Eleanor couldn't explain it, but she felt an overwhelming pull toward that light, as if it held the answers to something she had long since buried. Something that had been chasing her for years. Before she could take another step, the silence was broken by the sudden slam of a door downstairs. Her heart leaped in her chest and she spun around to face the stairwell. There was no one there. The house once again was utterly still. She could feel the presence of something unseen, lurking in the shadows. She couldn't escape the sensation that the house was alive, breathing with a dark, ancient life of its own. She exhaled shakily, her pulse quickening, and moved toward the source of the light, step by careful step. The floorboards groaned underfoot, and every inch of the house seemed to close in around her. When she reached the door at the end of the hall, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the brass handle. This was it, the moment when she would either uncover the truth or disappear forever into the house's secrets. She turned the knob and stepped into the room. It was empty. The light came from an old lamp on a side table, its bulb flickering weakly. The room itself was small, sparsely furnished, with only a faded armchair and a dresser against the far wall. A large, cracked mirror hung above the dresser, reflecting the dim light in strange, distorted angles. And then, just as Eleanor was about to turn away, something caught her eye. On the wall behind the dresser, hidden beneath a heavy layer of dust, was something painted in black. Symbols. Dark, jagged, and incomprehensible. She reached out, but her hand froze before it could touch the wall. A whisper. A soft, distant sound, barely audible but unmistakable. Eleanor turned her head sharply, her heart hammering in her chest. "Help me," the voice murmured. Her skin went cold. The room seemed to shrink around her, and the air grew heavier as if it were pressing in on her. "Who's there?" she demanded, but her voice was shaky, breaking under the weight of her fear. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Help me." A cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the lamp's dim light, and for a moment, everything went black. And then, just as quickly, the light flickered back on. But something had changed. The symbols on the wall, they were moving. The room was still. The light hummed weakly, its flickering casting strange, erratic shadows across the walls. But Eleanor couldn't take her eyes off the symbols. They were different now. They had moved. She hadn't imagined it. No, something in the air had shifted, and with it, the symbols seemed to pulse, slowly like the rhythm of a forgotten heartbeat. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she took a step backward, the floor creaking underfoot. The air felt thick with something ancient, something malevolent. The walls seemed to close in, their faded surface stretching unnaturally toward her. She needed to leave. The sense of being trapped, of something unseen watching her, was suffocating. "Help me." The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't from the walls. No, this time, it was from inside her own mind, a quiet voice that tugged at her consciousness like a memory she couldn't place. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she turned, half expecting someone, or something, to be standing behind her. But there was nothing. The room was empty, save for the old furniture and the mirror that hung above the dresser. It caught her gaze again, and this time, something was different. She didn't know why, but she felt drawn to it, pulled in by a force she couldn't understand. Her legs felt like lead, but she took a tentative step toward the mirror. The reflection was dim, blurry at first, but as she approached, the details began to sharpen. Her own face stared back at her, pale, wide-eyed, her expression twisted in a mix of fear and confusion. But something was off. The reflection didn't match her movements. For a brief moment, it seemed like her image was frozen in time, like she was no longer the one in control. And then, just as her hand reached out to touch the mirror, her reflection smiled. It wasn't her smile. Eleanor gasped and jerked her hand back, her heart racing in her chest. She stumbled away from the mirror, her legs buckling beneath her as she collapsed onto the floor. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps as she scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide with terror. The whispering voice had stopped, but the silence was no comfort. It only heightened the sense of unease that crawled along her spine. She could feel it now. The house was alive. It was watching her. It knew her. The symbols on the wall seemed to pulse once more, their shapes shifting like living things, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The air in the room had turned colder, and Eleanor could see her breath in front of her, visible in the dim light. Her mind raced. She needed to get out of here. But the house wasn't letting her go. It was drawing her in, pulling her deeper into its labyrinth of dark, forgotten secrets. And she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been here before, that something in her past had led her to this place. Her thoughts churned, but nothing made sense. She reached for the door, her fingers trembling as she grasped the handle. The old brass was slick with cold, but she twisted it anyway, only to find it stuck. The door wouldn't open. Her pulse quickened as she yanked at the handle again. It wouldn't budge. Panic began to creep in, sharp and insistent, but just as she was about to scream, the door released with an unsettling creak. Without thinking, Eleanor rushed into the hallway, her footsteps loud in the oppressive silence. She couldn't get out fast enough. The house felt like it was closing in on her, its walls narrowing with every step. Her mind reeled, struggling to hold on to any sense of clarity, but the images in her head were clouded, fractured, like memories trying to surface but slipping away just out of reach. She stumbled toward the staircase, her foot catching on a loose board. She gasped, her heart skipping a beat, but she caught herself before she fell, her hands bracing against the wall for support. The house groaned as if in response, and Eleanor froze, staring up at the ceiling. The whispers began again, this time louder and clearer. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were words. Full sentences, spoken in voices that seemed both foreign and familiar. "You don't remember, do you?" Her breath hitched in her throat. She spun around, expecting to see someone behind her, but the hallway was empty. The doors to the other rooms stood closed, their silence more suffocating than ever. But the voice continued as if it were inside her head. "You've been here before, Eleanor. This house, it remembers you." She closed her eyes, pressing her palms to her ears, trying to block out the voice. But it only grew louder, more insistent, more desperate. "It remembers your pain." Eleanor's heart slammed against her ribcage and her vision blurred. She couldn't breathe. The weight of the voice, the words that sliced through her, felt like chains pulling her down. She felt herself sinking into the darkness, the memories rushing back with overwhelming force. The house, no, the place, wasn't just haunted. It was connected to her, to something deep in her past that she had tried so hard to forget. Her mind flashed to a moment, a memory buried so deep she had almost convinced herself it was a dream. Her family, her mother, her father, her little brother. The house, the fire. It all came rushing back in a flood of terror. No. She shook her head violently, as if she could force the memory back into the depths from which it had come. But it was too late. The door at the end of the hall, the door she hadn't dared open before, was now ajar just slightly. She could feel it, the pull to go toward it. She knew what was on the other side. She had to know. With shaking hands, Eleanor stepped forward, her legs unsteady. The whispering voices had stopped, but their presence still hung in the air, like a fog that wouldn't lift. She reached out, slowly, her fingertips grazing the edge of the door. It was cool to the touch, and as she pushed it open, the familiar smell of smoke and burnt wood hit her like a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat. The room was filled with charred remnants of what once had been a living space. The walls were blackened, the floor warped and cracked. But it wasn't the devastation that made her knees buckle. It was what lay in the center of the room. A photograph. A family portrait, burnt but still somehow intact. Her family. Their smiling faces were frozen in time, caught in a moment before it all fell apart. Eleanor stepped forward, trembling. The edges of the photograph were singed, but the image was clear. Her mother, her father, and there he was, her little brother, grinning at the camera. The face of the boy who had died in the fire. A sharp pain shot through her chest. The voices returned, louder now, echoing through the room. "Do you remember?" Her hands shook as she reached for the photograph, her fingers brushing the burned edges. And in that moment, the whispers ceased. The house fell silent. And then footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from behind her. She didn't need to turn around. She already knew who it was. The room was still. The light hummed weakly, its flickering casting strange, erratic shadows across the walls. But Eleanor couldn't take her eyes off the symbols. They were different now. They had moved. She hadn't imagined it. No, something in the air had shifted, and with it, the symbols seemed to pulse, slowly, like the rhythm of a forgotten heartbeat. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she took a step backward, the floor creaking underfoot. The air felt thick with something ancient, something malevolent. The walls seemed to close in, their faded surface stretching unnaturally toward her. She needed to leave. The sense of being trapped, of something unseen watching her, was suffocating. "Help me." The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't from the walls. No, this time, it was from inside her own mind, a quiet voice that tugged at her consciousness like a memory she couldn't place. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she turned, half expecting someone, or something, to be standing behind her. But there was nothing. The room was empty, save for the old furniture and the mirror that hung above the dresser. It caught her gaze again, and this time, something was different. She didn't know why, but she felt drawn to it, pulled in by a force she couldn't understand. Her legs felt like lead, but she took a tentative step toward the mirror. The reflection was dim, blurry at first, but as she approached, the details began to sharpen. Her own face stared back at her, pale, wide-eyed, her expression twisted in a mix of fear and confusion. But something was off. The reflection didn't match her movements. For a brief moment, it seemed like her image was frozen in time, like she was no longer the one in control. And then, just as her hand reached out to touch the mirror, her reflection smiled. It wasn't her smile. Eleanor gasped and jerked her hand back, her heart racing in her chest. She stumbled away from the mirror, her legs buckling beneath her as she collapsed onto the floor. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps as she scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide with terror. The whispering voice had stopped, but the silence was no comfort. It only heightened the sense of unease that crawled along her spine. She could feel it now. The house was alive. It was watching her. It knew her. The symbols on the wall seemed to pulse once more, their shapes shifting like living things, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The air in the room had turned colder, and Eleanor could see her breath in front of her, visible in the dim light. Her mind raced. She needed to get out of here. But the house wasn't letting her go. It was drawing her in, pulling her deeper into its labyrinth of dark, forgotten secrets. And she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been here before, that something in her past had led her to this place. Her thoughts churned, but nothing made sense. She reached for the door, her fingers trembling as she grasped the handle. The old brass was slick with cold, but she twisted it anyway, only to find it stuck. The door wouldn't open. Her pulse quickened as she yanked at the handle again. It wouldn't budge. Panic began to creep in, sharp and insistent, but just as she was about to scream, the door released with an unsettling creak. Without thinking, Eleanor rushed into the hallway, her footsteps loud in the oppressive silence. She couldn't get out fast enough. The house felt like it was closing in on her, its walls narrowing with every step. Her mind reeled, struggling to hold on to any sense of clarity, but the images in her head were clouded, fractured, like memories trying to surface but slipping away just out of reach. She stumbled toward the staircase, her foot catching on a loose board. She gasped, her heart skipping a beat, but she caught herself before she fell, her hands bracing against the wall for support. The house groaned as if in response, and Eleanor froze, staring up at the ceiling. The whispers began again, this time louder and clearer. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were words. Full sentences, spoken in voices that seemed both foreign and familiar. "You don't remember, do you?" Her breath hitched in her throat. She spun around, expecting to see someone behind her, but the hallway was empty. The doors to the other rooms stood closed, their silence more suffocating than ever. But the voice continued as if it were inside her head. "You've been here before, Eleanor. This house, it remembers you." She closed her eyes, pressing her palms to her ears, trying to block out the voice. But it only grew louder, more insistent, more desperate. "It remembers your pain." Eleanor's heart slammed against her ribcage and her vision blurred. She couldn't breathe. The weight of the voice, the words that sliced through her, felt like chains pulling her down. She felt herself sinking into the darkness, the memories rushing back with overwhelming force. The house, no, the place, wasn't just haunted. It was connected to her, to something deep in her past that she had tried so hard to forget. Her mind flashed to a moment, a memory buried so deep she had almost convinced herself it was a dream. Her family, her mother, her father, her little brother. The house, the fire. It all came rushing back in a flood of terror. No. She shook her head violently, as if she could force the memory back into the depths from which it had come. But it was too late. The door at the end of the hall, the door she hadn't dared open before, was now ajar just slightly. She could feel it, the pull to go toward it. She knew what was on the other side. She had to know. With shaking hands, Eleanor stepped forward, her legs unsteady. The whispering voices had stopped, but their presence still hung in the air, like a fog that wouldn't lift. She reached out, slowly, her fingertips grazing the edge of the door. It was cool to the touch, and as she pushed it open, the familiar smell of smoke and burnt wood hit her like a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat. The room was filled with charred remnants of what once had been a living space. The walls were blackened, the floor warped and cracked. But it wasn't the devastation that made her knees buckle. It was what lay in the center of the room. A photograph. A family portrait, burnt but still somehow intact. Her family. Their smiling faces were frozen in time, caught in a moment before it all fell apart. Eleanor stepped forward, trembling. The edges of the photograph were singed, but the image was clear. Her mother, her father, and there he was, her little brother, grinning at the camera. The face of the boy who had died in the fire. A sharp pain shot through her chest. The voices returned, louder now, echoing through the room. Do you remember? Her hands shook as she reached for the photograph, her fingers brushing the burned edges. And in that moment, the whispers ceased. The house fell silent. And then footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from behind her. She didn't need to turn around. She already knew who it was. Eleanor's mind raced. She was no longer sure if she was in control of her own thoughts, if any of this was real, if the thing she had just encountered was something that existed outside of her mind, or if it was a manifestation of her own brokenness. The air around her thickened, pushing her down, suffocating her, but she couldn't tear her gaze away from the shadows. The figure, whatever it was, still lingered just beyond the edge of her sight, a silent presence waiting, watching. It wasn't the first time she had felt trapped in her own mind. No, she had spent years feeling as if she were drowning in the weight of something hidden, something deep and terrible. A secret she hadn't even known she was hiding from herself. And it was here now, in the very heart of this God-forsaken house, making its presence known, demanding she remember. The thing in the darkness, with its skeletal hand and endless black eyes, felt like the embodiment of that secret, that thing she could never outrun, no matter how far she tried to run from it. The thing that haunted her dreams, that whispered to her in her sleep, a shadow in the corner of her vision. Eleanor blinked and pressed a shaking hand to her forehead. She needed to pull herself together. She couldn't let the fear swallow her whole. She'd survived worse, right? She had to have. But as she closed her eyes for a moment, the memories came rushing back, unbidden. She had been just a child when the fire had taken everything from her. Her mother, her father, her little brother. It had all burned in a matter of minutes. Her home, her family, her sense of safety. One night, one flash of chaos, and the life she knew had crumbled to ash. They had found her later, alive but broken. Her family was gone. The house was gone. And her mind had split into pieces, shattered by the loss. It was a miracle she'd survived, but at what cost? The trauma had burrowed itself deep within her, a festering wound that never healed. Her brother, Tommy, he had been the worst part, the worst memory, because Tommy had been the one who hadn't made it out. He had been calling for her, or so she had thought. She could still hear his voice echoing through her mind, his tiny fingers clawing at the window, his face smeared with soot, his eyes wide with terror. But she had failed him. She hadn't been able to save him. Eleanor took a step backward, her feet unsteady as the weight of the memory pressed against her chest. She wanted to scream, to shout at the walls to stop closing in on her, but instead she choked on the grief that had never truly left. The thing in the shadows, it wasn't just the house. It was her guilt, her regret, her failure. She staggered toward the door, still gripping the photograph with a white-knuckled hand. The picture was now warped, the faces of her family so distorted that it almost didn't seem real. And yet they were there, staring at her, imploring her to do something, anything. But what could she do? The past was already written, burned into the fabric of who she was, a scar that would never fade. With trembling fingers, Eleanor reached for the door handle, but just as she touched it, the floor beneath her groaned. She froze. Not again. A sound echoed through the house, like a door slamming shut somewhere deep in the bowels of the building. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She spun around, her breath quickening, but when she turned, the room was empty. There was no figure in the shadows anymore, no sound other than the pounding of her own heart. For a moment, she thought she might be imagining things. Maybe she had finally cracked, the stress and fear breaking her. But then she saw it. The faint outline of something moving, no, not moving, growing, on the wall behind her. It was a symbol. A mark, drawn in what looked like blood, but it was thick and dark, too dark to be real. It spread across the wall, twisting in shapes she couldn't quite make sense of. It was both familiar and foreign, as if it had been there all along, waiting for her to notice. Her pulse quickened. Asterisk, this was it. This was where it all started, asterisk. The walls felt alive now, their cracks like veins pulsing with something terrible. She could almost hear the whisper again, faint but persistent, a voice from the past. The whispers were louder this time, urging her to remember. You know what happened here? Eleanor's breath hitched as the truth she had buried for years clawed its way to the surface, and she couldn't stop it. She saw the image of her father's face again, right before the fire, his wide eyes, the look of fear and sorrow. He had known. He had known about the thing that lived in this house, the thing that had taken everything from them. Her father's involvement with the occult, with the dark rituals. She had pushed it all from her mind, convinced herself it was just a nightmare, just the result of too many things gone wrong. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized. Her family had been connected to this place. They had known about the evil that resided here, and they had tried to escape it. But it was too late. The photograph she still held in her hands burned with a sickly heat now, and Eleanor's grip tightened. Her brother's face seemed to stare back at her with eyes full of accusation. The child she hadn't been able to save, the child who had been taken by whatever dark force had been lurking in that house all those years ago. And then, just as her mind began to fracture, the floor creaked again. Not behind her this time, but beneath her. The sound came from deep within the house, a deep groaning as though the house itself was waking up. The walls shook and Eleanor stumbled forward, her legs too weak to hold her up. Something was moving, something huge, something that had been dormant for too long. The air shifted again, becoming thick and oppressive, the weight of the house pushing down on her. Her breaths were shallow, her vision blurring as the darkness around her deepened. And then she heard it. A voice. Not from the walls, not from her mind, but from behind her, just over her shoulder. Eleanor, come to me. The voice was low, a rasping whisper that felt like it was being dragged through gravel. She turned around, but this time there was no figure waiting in the shadows. There was only the hallway behind her, stretching further than it should. And in that darkness she could make out the shape of something moving toward her. Her knees gave way and she crumpled to the floor. The thing, was coming. And this time it wasn't just waiting. It was coming for her. Eleanor's mind raced. She was no longer sure if she was in control of her own thoughts, if any of this was real, if the thing she had just encountered was something that existed outside of her mind, or if it was a manifestation of her own brokenness. The air around her thickened, pushing her down, suffocating her, but she couldn't tear her gaze away from the shadows. The figure, whatever it was, still lingered just beyond the edge of her sight, a silent presence waiting, watching. It wasn't the first time she had felt trapped in her own mind. No, she had spent years feeling as if she were drowning in the weight of something hidden, something deep and terrible. A secret she hadn't even known she was hiding from herself. And it was here now, in the very heart of this God-forsaken house, making its presence known, demanding she remember. The thing in the darkness, with its skeletal hand and endless black eyes, felt like the embodiment of that secret, that thing she could never outrun, no matter how far she tried to run from it. The thing that haunted her dreams, that whispered to her in her sleep, a shadow in the corner of her vision. Eleanor blinked and pressed a shaking hand to her forehead. She needed to pull herself together. She couldn't let the fear swallow her whole. She'd survived worse, right? She had to have. But as she closed her eyes for a moment, the memories came rushing back, unbidden. She had been just a child when the fire had taken everything from her. Her mother, her father, her little brother. It had all burned in a matter of minutes. Her home, her family, her sense of safety. One night, one flash of chaos, and the life she knew had crumbled to ash. They had found her later, alive but broken. Her family was gone. The house was gone. And her mind had split into pieces, shattered by the loss. It was a miracle she'd survived, but at what cost? The trauma had burrowed itself deep within her, a festering wound that never healed. Her brother, Tommy, he had been the worst part, the worst memory, because Tommy had been the one who hadn't made it out. He had been calling for her, or so she had thought. She could still hear his voice echoing through her mind, his tiny fingers clawing at the window, his face smeared with soot, his eyes wide with terror. But she had failed him. She hadn't been able to save him. Eleanor took a step backward, her feet unsteady as the weight of the memory pressed against her chest. She wanted to scream, to shout at the walls to stop closing in on her, but instead she choked on the grief that had never truly left. The thing in the shadows, it wasn't just the house. It was her guilt, her regret, her failure. She staggered toward the door, still gripping the photograph with a white-knuckled hand. The picture was now warped, the faces of her family so distorted that it almost didn't seem real. And yet they were there, staring at her, imploring her to do something, anything. But what could she do? The past was already written, burned into the fabric of who she was, a scar that would never fade. With trembling fingers, Eleanor reached for the door handle, But just as she touched it, the floor beneath her groaned. She froze. Not again. A sound echoed through the house, like a door slamming shut somewhere deep in the bowels of the building. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She spun around, her breath quickening, but when she turned, the room was empty. There was no figure in the shadows anymore, no sound other than the pounding of her own heart. For a moment, she thought she might be imagining things. Maybe she had finally cracked, the stress and fear breaking her. But then she saw it. The faint outline of something moving, no, not moving, growing, on the wall behind her. It was a symbol. A mark, drawn in what looked like blood, but it was thick and dark, too dark to be real. It spread across the wall, twisting in shapes she couldn't quite make sense of. It was both familiar and foreign, as if it had been there all along, waiting for her to notice. Her pulse quickened. Asterisk, this was it. This was where it all started, asterisk. The walls felt alive now, their cracks like veins pulsing with something terrible. She could almost hear the whisper again, faint but persistent, a voice from the past. The whispers were louder this time, urging her to remember. You know what happened here? Eleanor's breath hitched as the truth she had buried for years clawed its way to the surface, and she couldn't stop it. She saw the image of her father's face again, right before the fire, his wide eyes, the look of fear and sorrow. He had known. He had known about the thing that lived in this house, the thing that had taken everything from them. Her father's involvement with the occult, with the dark rituals, she had pushed it all from her mind, convinced herself it was just a nightmare, just the result of too many things gone wrong. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized. Her family had been connected to this place. They had known about the evil that resided here, and they had tried to escape it. But it was too late. The photograph she still held in her hands burned with a sickly heat now, and Eleanor's grip tightened. Her brother's face seemed to stare back at her with eyes full of accusation. The child she hadn't been able to save, the child who had been taken by whatever dark force had been lurking in that house all those years ago. And then, just as her mind began to fracture, the floor creaked again. Not behind her this time, but beneath her. The sound came from deep within the house, a deep groaning as though the house itself was waking up. The walls shook, and Eleanor stumbled forward, her legs too weak to hold her up. Something was moving, something huge, something that had been dormant for too long. The air shifted again, becoming thick and oppressive, the weight of the house pushing down on her. Her breaths were shallow, her vision blurring as the darkness around her deepened. And then she heard it. A voice. Not from the walls, not from her mind, but from behind her, just over her shoulder. Eleanor, come to me. The voice was low, a rasping whisper that felt like it was being dragged through gravel. She turned around, but this time there was no figure waiting in the shadows. There was only the hallway behind her, stretching further than it should. And in that darkness she could make out the shape of something moving toward her. Her knees gave way and she crumpled to the floor. The thing, asterisk at asterisk, was coming. And this time it wasn't just waiting. It was coming for her. Eleanor's breath came in ragged gasps, the weight of her panic pressing against her chest. She stumbled forward, every step felt like a battle, her legs shaking with the effort to remain upright. The glass shard in her hand had become her only lifeline, the cool surface against her palm grounding her in a reality she was desperate to hold on to. But with every step, the house seemed to grow darker, its oppressive silence thickening around her, closing in, suffocating her. She had no idea where she was going. No plan, no path forward. Just the need to get away, to escape this nightmare that had so thoroughly consumed her. The hallway stretched before her like a never-ending abyss, and with every turn, she was met with the same oppressive sense of being watched. She could feel it now, more than ever, the gaze of something unseen, something waiting in the shadows. And though she didn't want to look, something deep within her knew that if she didn't confront whatever was watching, it would consume her body and soul. Eleanor's hand shook as she reached for the door handle at the end of the hallway. The air was so thick with dread that it was hard to move, hard to think. She could feel her own thoughts slipping away, like water trickling through her fingers, leaving behind only fragments of fear and confusion. Just as her fingers brushed the cold metal, a low hum filled the air, a sound so quiet at first that she thought she might have imagined it. But it grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the entire house, vibrating through the floorboards, through her bones. It was a steady hum, like a faraway engine, or the sound of something ancient, something old, waking up after centuries of slumber. The humming seemed to come from deep within the house, from below her feet, from beneath the very earth itself. It was like the pulse of the house had quickened, as if something beneath it was stirring, waiting to be released. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. Asterisk, no. Not again, asterisk. She backed away from the door, her eyes scanning the darkness, searching for anything that would explain the strange sound, the strange feeling that was pressing in on her from all sides. Her mind raced, but no answers came. And then it happened. From the shadows, something moved, slowly, deliberately, crawling toward her like a great, unseen force. A creeping mass of darkness that seemed to rise from the very walls themselves. At first, it was just a shape, a growing outline that she could barely make out. But as it came closer, she saw it more clearly. An eye. A single, impossibly large eye. It hovered in the air before her, its black iris unblinking, its gaze fixed directly on her. It was the eye of something ancient, something beyond her understanding. The pupil was a dark void, endless and swallowing, and the surrounding sclera seemed to swirl with shadows, as though the very darkness was alive within it. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't tear her eyes away from it. The eye seemed to pulse with a rhythmic, hypnotic beat, as if it were breathing in sync with the hum of the house. It was like the eye was part of the house itself, like it was the living heart of the building, watching, judging. It wasn't just watching her, though. It was searching her. It was digging into her thoughts, peeling away the layers of her mind like the pages of an old book. The eye could see into her, into the depths of her guilt, her fear, her shame. It knew her better than she knew herself. The voice came again, low and rasping, not from the eye, but from within her mind. Asterisk, you can't run, Eleanor, asterisk. The words slithered around her thoughts, their presence invasive, familiar. This was what had been lurking all along, the thing in the darkness. It was no longer just a shadow, a specter from her past. It was here, in her mind, in her heart, feeding on her every insecurity, every broken piece of her soul. The eye blinked, slowly, its gaze unwavering. And in that instant, Eleanor felt the ground beneath her shift. The house seemed to groan, a sound that rattled the bones of the structure, a deep, guttural noise that made the very walls tremble. She staggered back, fear flooding her body, her skin crawling with the sensation of being too close to something she could never fully understand. Asterisk, this isn't real. It can't be real, asterisk, she thought, but the words felt weak, desperate. She knew it was real. The house was alive. The thing watching her was alive. And it wasn't just some passing manifestation of her mind. It was the house itself, its hunger, its insatiable need for something, someone, to feed on. And right now, that someone was her. She had to escape. She had to. But the door was locked. Her mind spun, trying to process the situation, but it was impossible. She felt trapped, cornered by the weight of her memories, the presence of the thing, and the ever-watchful eye. She was suffocating in the very air she breathed, as though every breath was stealing a piece of her sanity, piece by piece. And then the hum changed. It became more intense, rising in pitch like a scream building just beneath the surface. The eye flickered, its gaze narrowing, and Eleanor could swear she saw something. Something behind it, something vast and dark, far larger than the eye itself. A shadow, a shape, a presence that loomed just beyond her vision, pulling her in. Asterisk, you are so close, Eleanor, asterisk, the voice whispered, and this time, it was not in her mind. It was in the room. Behind her. The air around her shifted, the temperature plummeting as a breath, cold and ancient, touched the back of her neck. She spun around, her eyes wide, searching the darkness, but saw nothing. Yet she could feel it. The weight of something pressing against her, its presence so close it was suffocating. She was no longer alone. The thing was here in the room with her. It was standing behind her, just out of sight, and it was waiting. For what? For her. Eleanor's hand trembled as she raised the glass shard, her heart racing in her chest. She could feel the power of the house, its malevolent force surrounding her. The walls seemed to close in tighter with each passing second, and the eye, still suspended in the air, was pulling her gaze back to it, pulling her into its depths. She had no choice. She had to fight back. She wasn't going to die here. Not like this. Not in this house of horrors that had already stolen so much from her. With a final, determined breath, Eleanor swung the glass shard toward the eye. The moment it made contact, the world seemed to implode. The instant Eleanor's shard of glass collided with the eye, everything erupted into chaos. It was as though time itself had splintered into jagged pieces, each fragment cutting through her senses like shards of broken glass. The house trembled beneath her feet, the walls shuddering as though something immense had just been unleashed from its dark prison. Her breath caught in her throat, her body jerking back as if repelled by an invisible force. The air itself seemed to thicken, clinging to her skin, making each breath a laborious task. She stumbled, barely managing to keep herself upright, her hand still clutching the jagged glass. her fingers slick with sweat and blood. The eye, that horrible, relentless eye, vanished. But its presence lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating, like a thick fog that refused to dissipate. Eleanor's heart pounded violently in her chest, each beat echoing in her skull. Her eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for any sign of escape. But the house, that insidious, living entity, was closing in on her. The door was still locked. The shadows were still watching. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure standing motionless in the doorway. For a moment, Eleanor thought she was seeing things. Her mind shattered by fear, exhaustion, and the horrors she had already faced. But the figure was unmistakable. It was tall, draped in dark clothing, the face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat that cast long, eerie shadows over the figure's features. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but the air around it seemed to ripple with a cold, unnatural energy. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She knew this figure. She had seen it before years ago, in the brief flashes of memory that had haunted her since the fire. The figure was from her past. It was the man who had come to their house that night, the one who had told her mother that she needed to leave, that it was too late for them. He had come before the fire, as though he had known it was coming, as though he had been waiting for it. A chill ran down Eleanor's spine. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. The figure stepped forward, and suddenly the air was filled with the same hum, the same unnatural sound that had shaken the house to its core. It was louder now, almost deafening, and it seemed to pulse with an otherworldly rhythm. The man's face remained hidden in shadow, but Eleanor could feel his gaze, cold and unyielding, boring into her. You've returned, Eleanor. The voice came, deep and gravelly, its tone thick with an almost reverent darkness. It sent a shiver down her spine. The house calls for you. Eleanor's blood ran cold. The house had called for her? She didn't understand. She had left. She had run from the past, from everything that had happened. So why was it pulling her back now? Why now? You shouldn't have come back. The man continued, his voice laden with a sorrow that seemed so real, so palpable, that it made Eleanor's chest tighten. The house remembers, you see. It always remembers. What do you mean? Eleanor whispered, her voice hoarse and trembling. She didn't want to hear the answer. She didn't want to understand. But the man stepped closer, his presence growing heavier, darker, like a shadow that stretched across the very fabric of reality. The fire, he said, and his voice dropped to a low, dangerous whisper. It wasn't an accident. The house knew. It always knows. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as the weight of his words crashed down upon her. She staggered backward, her pulse racing in her ears. No, this couldn't be true. She remembered that night so vividly, the smoke, the fire, the screams. But she had never believed in the idea of the house itself. Never thought it could have a will, a hunger. What are you talking about? She demanded, her voice cracking as fear twisted in her gut. The house can't. The house is alive. He interrupted, his words so cold that they seemed to freeze the very air between them. It has always been alive, Eleanor. It feeds on those who enter it. And it never lets them leave. His words hung in the air, thick with the weight of history, as if they carried the full burden of the past. The memories of her childhood, the fire that had consumed everything she held dear, the man who had warned them, all crashed together in one overwhelming moment. The house, this place, wasn't just a building. It was something older, something more, and it had always been watching. It had always been waiting. The man's form seemed to shimmer, the darkness around him deepening, becoming more solid, more real. His face was still hidden, but Eleanor could feel him watching her, his presence suffocating, closing in like a vice. It's too late. He murmured, his voice filled with a kind of pity. It has chosen you, Eleanor. Just like it chose your family before you. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat, and for a brief, fleeting moment, she felt as though the world was about to collapse beneath her. She thought of her family, their faces, their love, their deaths. Had it all been for nothing? Had the fire been part of some greater design? And if so, was she doomed to repeat it? No, she refused to believe it. She wasn't going to let this thing take her too. She wasn't going to give in to the house. But as if in response to her defiance, the house itself seemed to groan, a deep, resonating sound that rattled her bones. The walls trembled, and the floor beneath her feet seemed to shift, as though the house was alive, shifting in its hunger. The door, her only possible escape, shuddered, the wood creaking as if it were alive, a living entity fighting against her. And just as she reached for the doorknob, she heard it. A soft, whispering voice, barely a murmur, but unmistakable. Asterisk, we're waiting for you, Eleanor asterisk. The house had never let her go. It had always been waiting. And now it was finally ready to take what it had always wanted. Eleanor's hand hovered over the door handle, her fingers trembling violently. The soft whisper of the house, the low, taunting voice that had drifted from the shadows, still echoed in her ears, reverberating through her skull like a death knell. We're waiting for you, Eleanor. It wasn't just the voice that haunted her now. It was the house itself. The creaking floors beneath her feet, the deep, guttural moans from within the walls, the oppressive, suffocating air that seemed to grow thicker with every passing moment. The house was alive. And it was calling to her, pulling her closer to something she could no longer ignore. With a sharp intake of breath, Eleanor yanked the door open, the wood groaning in protest as though it too didn't want her to leave. The corridor beyond was dark, pitch black, and the oppressive silence hung over it like a shroud. But the dark wasn't empty. She could feel it, the pressure of something unseen, something just out of her reach, watching, waiting. Get out, her mind screamed. Get out before it's too late. But there was no escaping now. The house had already taken root in her soul, entwining itself around her thoughts, her memories, and there was no running from it. Every step she took down the hallway seemed to carry her deeper into its grasp, its pull becoming harder to resist. She wasn't just being hunted, she was being drawn in. The walls themselves seemed to close in around her as she walked, the shadows stretching impossibly long, curling toward her like the fingers of a great beast ready to snatch her up. The footsteps came again. Soft at first, barely perceptible, but growing louder with each passing second. Eleanor froze, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't her footsteps she was hearing. Someone, or something, was following her. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat an excruciating reminder of her helplessness. She turned, her eyes wide with panic, but the hallway was empty, the dark corners untouched by light. She could see nothing, hear nothing but the relentless echo of her own breathing and the ever-growing sound of footsteps. And then it hit her, asterisk, the walls asterisk. The thought crashed through her mind like a lightning bolt. The walls, the floors, the entire house, they were alive. It wasn't just a presence, it was a sensation, a memory that was woven into the very fabric of the house, a history that had been passed down through every crack in the wood, every nail in the foundation. The house knew her. It had always known her. A sudden, sharp noise broke through her spiraling thoughts, a whispering like a soft, almost inaudible murmur that emanated from the walls themselves. She spun around, her body tense, her hand clutching the shard of glass, her only defense. But again there was nothing. Just the dark, quiet hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly before her. The walls shifted. It wasn't just the creaking of old wood. It was a movement, something subtle but undeniable. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting, the very air vibrating with an unseen force. The floor beneath her feet groaned as though it was shifting, realigning itself. It's the house, she thought, her mind scrambling for something to hold on to. The house is changing. The walls were no longer static, no longer simply enclosing her in this nightmare. They were alive, alive with memories, with things that had been buried for so long. The house was revealing its secrets, layer by layer, and Eleanor was the one it had chosen to reveal them to. The door behind her slammed shut with a deafening crash, the sound reverberating through the corridor like a gunshot, making Eleanor jump back, her heart racing. She whipped around, but there was no escape now. The house had sealed her in. The walls had closed in on her, trapping her like an insect in a web. The whispering grew louder until it was no longer just a murmur. It was a chorus, a cacophony of voices that seemed to rise from the very bones of the house itself. She could hear them all, soft, disjointed phrases, fragments of conversations that made no sense, words overlapping each other like ghosts crying out from the past. Asterisk, don't leave, it's not your fault. Asterisk, one voice said, its tone cold and distant, like a memory long forgotten. Asterisk, we warned you, but you didn't listen. Asterisk, another voice murmured, closer this time, more urgent. Asterisk, you can never leave, you'll never leave. Asterisk, a third voice hissed, the words full of malice and hunger. Eleanor's eyes flickered around the hallway, her pulse pounding in her throat. Who are these voices? What do they want from me? And then, through the wall in front of her, something moved. A shift. A sound like scraping, like claws dragging across wood, and before she could react, the wall itself buckled, its surface warping and contorting as though it were made of something alive, something unnatural. The air grew colder, and Eleanor could see her breath, sharp and visible in the dark, like the smoke of something burning. The wall cracked open, a jagged line splitting down its center, revealing a dark, narrow space beyond. Something was waiting in the shadows. Something ancient. Something that had been here longer than she had, longer than anyone had. Eleanor hesitated. She wanted to run, to turn and flee, but her body wouldn't obey. She couldn't move. She couldn't look away. And then she saw it. A hand. A pale, gaunt hand stretched out from the crack in the wall, its fingers long and skeletal, its skin a sickly gray. The nails were long, blackened, like talons, and they scraped against the wood as they moved. The hand reached further, followed by another, then another, until a shape began to emerge from the shadows. A figure. A thing. It was tall, taller than a man, its body thin, almost skeletal. Its face was obscured by a veil of dark hair, but Eleanor could feel its eyes, cold eyes, burning into her, seeing her, watching her, knowing her. The thing opened its mouth, but no sound came. Its lips curled back in a grotesque, inhuman smile. The house was alive, but this thing, this creature, was something far worse. It was the thing the house had been feeding on, waiting for, and it had finally come for her. Eleanor took a step back, the shard of glass slipping from her grasp, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The thing stepped forward, its eyes never leaving her. And then, with a low, guttural growl, it lunged. The darkness beyond the shattered ceiling was suffocating. It wasn't the kind of darkness that enveloped a room on a starless night, but a living, breathing void that seemed to stretch on forever. It was endless. And from within that abyss, something stirred. Eleanor felt it in the pit of her stomach, a pull deep and insistent, like the tug of a current beneath the surface of the ocean. The house groaned around her, a living thing in pain, as if it too was aware of the enormity of what had been unleashed. The walls continued to crack, the floor buckling under the weight of forces too ancient to understand. The very air tasted wrong, thick with an unnatural stillness that hung over her like a heavy shroud. The creature, if it could still be called that, had twisted into something unrecognizable. Its body had contorted, its form stretching and melting in ways that defied logic. It was no longer just a creature. It was a part of something much larger, something monstrous, its hunger now a part of the very fabric of the house itself. Eleanor could see the gleaming remnants of its eyes, burning with a ferocity that was beyond human understanding, staring at her from its shifting mass. But it wasn't alone. The darkness in the ceiling pulsed. It was a deep, throbbing blackness that seemed to swallow all light, all hope. From within, shapes began to emerge, shifting figures that twisted and writhed in the shadows, their forms barely visible, like ghosts trying to claw their way into the world. The air was thick with their presence, suffocating, filling her chest with a sudden, paralyzing weight. Her hands shook violently as she backed away, but there was no escape. The creature was everywhere now. It wasn't bound to the walls or the cracks in the foundation anymore. It had become one with the house. The house itself had turned into a gateway, a conduit for something much worse. Something from beyond the veil of human understanding. Eleanor could hear the voices again, those soft, taunting whispers, now louder, clearer, as if they were being spoken directly into her mind. You let it out, one voice murmured. You freed it, it's too late, Eleanor, another hissed, its tone filled with a twisted glee. You can't undo what you've done, The floor beneath her feet shuddered as though the very ground was alive, trembling with the weight of something old and unfathomable, something that had been waiting for this moment for centuries. And then, in the midst of the darkness, Eleanor saw it, the thing she had unknowingly set free. It wasn't just a creature anymore. It was a force, a presence. The walls of the house bulged, and the very air seemed to warp, the space around her twisting and bending as if reality itself were breaking down. She could feel the edges of her vision stretching, warping, the once familiar hallway now turning into something grotesque, unfamiliar. It was as if the house was no longer a house. It was becoming something else, something alien. The house was collapsing, tearing at the seams, and the darkness was pouring in, an unstoppable tide that flooded every corner, every crack, every hidden space. The walls began to pulse, and the floor beneath her feet cracked open, sending splinters of wood shooting up like jagged teeth. Eleanor stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest, but there was nowhere to go, nowhere to run. The house was no longer a place. It was a prison, and she had been its last prisoner. She turned toward the shattered ceiling, the abyss above her yawning wide, and with it, the unmistakable presence of something else, something more ancient, more powerful than anything she could comprehend. It wasn't just the creature. The creature was only a vessel, a mere fragment of what had been locked away in the heart of the house for so long. And now it was free. Eleanor reached for the wall, her hand trembling as it brushed against the symbol she had uncovered earlier. The one she had touched without understanding. The one that had triggered the collapse. She tried to pull away, but it was as if the wall itself was holding her, trapping her in place, the mark pulsing under her fingertips like a heartbeat. She could feel it, the pole star. The pull of something much greater than herself, something far beyond her ability to understand. Her body was no longer her own, her mind no longer tethered to the world she knew. The house had swallowed her body and soul, and now the abyss was calling. The voices from the dark were louder now, closer. They were no longer whispers. They were commands. Come to us, they beckoned. Come and join us, Eleanor's vision blurred, her mind a haze of terror and confusion, but one thought stood out above all else. She had to get out. She had to find a way to close the door, But as the last sliver of light vanished from the room, swallowed by the endless dark above, she realized with an icy certainty that there was no escape. The darkness was already inside her. It had been all along. The creature's form was no longer distinct. It had dissolved, melded into the very shadows, its hunger no longer physical but spiritual, reaching into her very soul, feeding on her fear. And there was nothing left in her to fight it anymore. Nothing left to stop it. As the walls continued to crack, the floor beneath her splintering apart, Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She could feel her body changing, the air growing cold, her heart slowing, as if the house itself were feeding on her, drawing the last remnants of her will to live into its cold, dark heart. And then, in the stillness, a sound, a low, guttural hum, began to rise from the depths of the abyss. It was the sound of something ancient, something powerful, resonating through the very bones of the house. It was the sound of something waking. The last thing Eleanor saw before the darkness took her was the glowing eyes, the eyes of the thing, staring back at her. Unblinking, unfeeling, waiting. And then the house swallowed her whole. The silence was overwhelming. For a long moment there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Just the oppressive weight of stillness pressing down on Eleanor, as though the entire world had ceased to exist. Her mind, foggy and disoriented, couldn't make sense of where she was or what had happened. All she could grasp was the suffocating blackness around her, an all-encompassing void that clung to her like a second skin. But then, just as she thought she might drown in the silence, a soft noise emerged, distant, faint, like a whisper carried on a breeze. It was a voice, but not one she recognized. It was a voice she couldn't understand, and yet, it felt familiar. Eleanor, Her name, barely a murmur, floated through the dark. She froze, her pulse quickening. It was as if the very air around her had thickened, become alive with the presence of something unseen, something watching her. She tried to move, but her body felt sluggish, like it was trapped in the depths of a dream. Her limbs refused to obey, the weight of the darkness pressing her into place. She was paralyzed, unable to fight against the growing sense of dread that crawled under her skin. Eleanor. Come closer. The voice was softer now, as though coaxing her from the shadows. It had a strange, hypnotic quality to it, one that both terrified and entranced her. The more she listened, the harder it became to resist. Something in that voice called to her, like an irresistible pull from the abyss. Her breath was shallow, ragged. She wanted to scream, to call out, but her voice wouldn't work. It was as if her throat had been sealed shut, locked away in a cage she couldn't escape. You set us free, Eleanor, The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Her mind reeled, struggling to grasp what they meant. Free. Had she set something free? Or had something been waiting for her all along? You belong to us now, That was the moment the reality of it all hit her like a tidal wave. She was not alone here in this darkness. This wasn't just some phantom voice. This was it. The thing. The force that had been lurking in the house, waiting, patiently biding its time. It wasn't content to merely be set loose. It needed her. Her breath hitched, her chest tightening with panic. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't move. She could only hear. And what she heard was a chorus now, growing louder, more insistent. The voices weren't just from one place anymore, they were all around her, everywhere. They surrounded her like a net, pulling her deeper into the abyss. You opened the door, Eleanor, you released us from our prison, you will never leave, The voices crescendoed into a cacophony of sound, a deep, guttural rumble that reverberated in her bones. Eleanor's mind splintered as the overwhelming force of their words slammed into her. She tried to fight it, tried to shut out the sounds, but they were everywhere, rising like a flood of darkness. She could feel the weight of it all pushing against her, suffocating her. She was losing herself. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the voices stopped. There was a cold, still silence in its place, the kind that filled the spaces between thoughts. Eleanor blinked, trying to adjust her eyes to the nothingness, but she couldn't make sense of anything. All she could see was the void, the endless abyss stretching out before her, as though it were infinite. A chill ran down her spine. It wasn't just the silence that unnerved her, it was the absence of something. The very air had changed. It had become raw. Cold, heavier, as if it was absorbing the last remnants of warmth she had left. And then she felt it, the first real sensation that connected her to the world around her, as if the shadows themselves were closing in. Her fingers twitched, and she instinctively reached for her side, where she had been holding on to something. To her surprise, her hand closed around an object, a small, smooth stone, cold to the touch. She didn't remember picking it up, but it felt like something important, something she had been holding on to without even knowing it. As her fingers tightened around it, a jagged crack split the air, followed by a deep groan, the sound of a building straining under the weight of its own history. Eleanor jerked her hand away from the stone, the noise echoing in her ears, but it was too late. She could feel the shift, something happening, something moving, shifting around her. The ground beneath her feet trembled, the sensation rippling through her bones, causing her to stumble. The darkness seemed to pulse rhythmically, like the beating of a heart. A low, thrumming energy emanated from all around her, as though the very fabric of reality was tearing at the seams. And then, out of the corner of her eye, a figure appeared. A shadow at first, barely a flicker in the edges of her vision. But then it solidified, taking form, slowly, painfully. It was humanoid, but twisted, distorted, as if its very shape was something borrowed, something not meant to exist in this realm. It loomed over her, its form jagged and broken, a distortion of what should have been. Its eyes, those eyes, burned with a sickly yellow glow, like coals smoldering in the darkness. They fixed on her, unblinking, unfeeling. And in that gaze, Eleanor saw something that made her blood run cold. It was watching her. Waiting. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. It was as if the very act of breathing was an impossibility, like she was drowning in the air itself. The figure took a step forward, and with it came a wave of pressure, like a weight pressing down on her chest. It was unbearable. Every part of her felt like it was being pulled apart, stretched thin across the very fabric of existence. "You freed me," the figure rasped, its voice like the sound of dry leaves being crushed underfoot. "Now you belong to me." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat, and the world around her seemed to collapse inward. She was falling into the abyss, into the cold, dark pit of something far older, far more powerful than her. And all she could do was fall. The fall was endless. It wasn't a physical plunge, but a suffocating descent into the darkest parts of her mind. Eleanor's body was weightless, untethered to anything but the gnawing sensation of inevitability that tore at her soul. Her thoughts scattered like broken glass, shattering into fragments of horror and confusion. She tried to call out, to scream, but the darkness swallowed her voice, leaving nothing but a hollow, deafening silence. It was the silence that pressed hardest on her chest. It clung to her, suffocating, as if the very air had become a liquid, viscous and choking. She felt as though she were drowning in an abyss that had no end. The figure, that twisted shadow, lingered in her thoughts, its glowing yellow eyes burning through the dark. "Now you belong to me," it had said, its voice like rust scraping across metal. "Now you are mine." Those words echoed in her mind, relentless, an unholy mantra that she could not escape. Her thoughts, once sharp and clear, were now clouded, weighed down by the suffocating sense of despair that seemed to wrap itself around her very being. It felt as though time had stopped. There was no past, no future, only the eternal now. And in this moment, there was no escape. But then, as her mind began to slip into the edge of madness, there was a shift. A sound. A soft whisper in the void that wasn't the voice of the creature, but something else, something far gentler. Eleanor, She flinched at the sound of her name. It wasn't the haunting, malevolent voice that had followed her throughout the house. No, this voice was different. It was soft, familiar, a memory. Eleanor. Please listen. Her heart stuttered in her chest. She strained against the overwhelming pressure, the crushing darkness, trying to focus on the sound of that voice. Her mind fought against the darkness, reaching out for something, anything, that might pull her out of the abyss. And then, just when she thought it was impossible to go any further, there was a flicker. A light, weak, faint, but it was there. It flickered in the distance like a distant star struggling to survive in an unforgiving sky. Light? Her heart surged with a desperate hope. She wasn't sure what the light meant, but it felt like freedom. It felt like salvation. She reached for it. As she moved, the darkness shifted, slithering around her, tightening its grip. But she fought through it, pushing against the pressure, crawling through the murk. The voice, the familiar, soft voice, whispered again, urging her onward. You have to wake up, Eleanor. Her hands reached out, fingers brushing against something cold, something solid. She was close. She could feel it. The light was just beyond her grasp. And then, with a suddenness that shocked her to the core, her body was yanked back. The darkness, once a passive force, became an angry, violent thing. It wrapped around her, crushing her chest, pulling her deeper into the void. It was as if the very fabric of her being was being torn apart, ripped from the world she knew, and cast into some horrible place of torment. No. Eleanor gasped, a raw sob escaping her throat. She struggled to move, but her limbs were no longer her own. The darkness had claimed her. It was her now. You wanted to be free, the figure's voice rasped, its laughter now a haunting melody that echoed in her ears. This is the price of freedom, Eleanor. This is the price of letting us out, The pressure mounted, unbearable. Her vision blurred, and she could feel her mind slipping, fracturing. She tried to hold on to herself, but the darkness wouldn't allow it. It was everywhere. It had become a part of her. It was feeding on her. But just as she thought she couldn't fight anymore, a memory flashed in her mind. Something from the past, a flicker of light, a tiny spark of hope. It was a face. Her face, a reflection. A version of herself she had long forgotten. You are more than this, the voice whispered again, the same voice from before, so familiar. Remember who you are, It was enough. With one last, desperate effort, Eleanor clawed at the darkness, pulling herself toward the light. The weight of the void pushed against her, but she ignored it, focusing only on the image of herself, her true self. And in that moment, the light grew stronger. The pressure began to fade, slowly at first, then all at once. It was as though a great weight had been lifted from her chest. The darkness that had once suffocated her started to dissolve, retreating into the corners where it had waited for so long. Eleanor opened her eyes. The world was different now. No longer suffocating. No longer oppressive. She was no longer lost in the abyss. She was back. She could feel her breath, slow and steady, the warmth of the air around her. It was the strangest sensation, as if waking from a terrible dream, but this dream had been real. The house, what was left of it, stood before her, the ruins of its crumbling structure scattered around her. The air felt thick, but not with terror. Instead, it was heavy with release. The darkness was still there, lingering in the corners of the house, but it no longer had control over her. The house had been broken. The force that had controlled it, the thing that had haunted it for so long, was no longer a threat. But even as the last remnants of the creature's power bled away into nothingness, Eleanor knew, that there was a price to be paid. The door, the one she had opened to release the darkness, had been closed. But it hadn't been sealed. The echoes of the evil that had once controlled the house still lingered. The house was still alive, still watching. And as Eleanor stood in the wreckage, she could feel its presence, like an old, familiar friend. Waiting. She wasn't free. None of them ever truly were. There would always be a cost. And in the stillness of the night, as the wind whispered through the shattered walls, she understood what it was. The house would never let her go. It was waiting for her, biding its time. And one day, soon perhaps, it would call to her again. But for now she was free. And that was enough. The wind howled through the trees, their skeletal branches twisting in a rhythm of ancient despair. Beneath the soft, menacing crackle of thunder, a lone car sputtered down a narrow, weather-worn road. The headlights barely cut through the dense fog that crept along the earth like the hands of something unseen, brushing against the cold, damp asphalt. In the distance, the silhouette of a decaying house stood, its windows black and empty, staring into the night as though it had witnessed horrors far older than the earth itself. Jonah Harris leaned back in the worn seat of his car, the smell of stale coffee mixing with the faint scent of cigarette smoke that lingered in the air. His fingers drummed lightly on the steering wheel, the only sound in the car besides the low hum of the engine. He had been on the road for hours, his destination uncertain, his mind preoccupied with the gnawing emptiness that had followed him for years. The house loomed closer, and Jonah felt a jolt of unease in his chest. It was an ordinary house, at least on the surface. Once grand perhaps, but now old and weathered, with peeling paint and a sagging porch that seemed ready to collapse under the weight of time. But something about it unsettled him. Something in the way the fog clung to it, making it seem less like a building and more like an ancient relic, an artifact left to rot in the world's forgotten corners. He pulled up in front of the house and shut off the engine. The fog enveloped the car instantly, making the world outside seem distant, unreachable. Jonah hesitated for a moment, staring at the house, trying to ignore the feeling that something was waiting for him inside. But there was no other place to go. No friends, no family, no place to turn. He was alone just as he had been for years. With a deep breath, Jonah opened the door and stepped out. The air was thick with moisture, the dampness sinking into his clothes, his skin. He took a few steps toward the house, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path that led to the front door. The porch was as dilapidated as the rest of the house, the wooden planks creaking underfoot as he stepped closer to the door. The wind picked up again, sending a chill through his bones. He reached for the doorknob, its cold metal biting into his palm. The door was locked, but the latch didn't seem to hold with much conviction. A gentle push was all it took to open it. Inside, the house smelled of dust, mildew, and something darker, something faint but unmistakable, like the scent of rot buried deep within the walls. The floorboards creaked under Jonah's weight as he stepped inside, the sound unsettling in the otherwise quiet house. He stood in a dimly lit hallway, the air heavy and still. Shadows clung to the corners and the walls seemed to close in on him. Jonah's heart raced. He could feel the weight of the place bearing down on him, but he couldn't place why. The house felt alive, as though it was watching him, studying him. Every step he took felt deliberate, like the building was waiting for something to happen. He shook his head, trying to rid himself of the feeling, but it lingered. It gnawed at him, digging under his skin. The hall stretched before him, lined with closed doors. Each one seemed to hide something, a secret kept in the darkness beyond. Jonah's mind wandered back to the last time he had felt this way, when he was younger, when he still had a family. His father, his mother, his sister, they were all gone now, lost to time, to the tragedies that had shaped his life. Jonah's gaze fell to a small, cracked mirror hanging on the wall at the end of the hall. His reflection stared back at him, but something was wrong. His face was pale, gaunt, like the reflection of a man who had been lost to time as well. His eyes were sunken, hollow, as if he had seen things no one should see. A soft noise broke the silence, like something brushing against the floor. Jonah's head snapped toward the sound, his breath catching in his throat. The hallway remained still, but the air was heavier now, charged with an unseen presence. He took a step forward, his hand trembling as he reached for the door to his right. It creaked open with an unsettling groan, revealing a room shrouded in darkness. Jonah stood there, his heart pounding, his body frozen. A strange chill swept through him, and the air seemed to thicken, pressing against him. The room felt wrong, as though it had not been disturbed in years. Dust lay thick on the furniture, but there was something else. Something faintly familiar, something that tugged at the edge of his memory. The feeling of eyes on him intensified. He could feel the weight of the house closing in, suffocating him with its presence. The door behind him slammed shut with a violent bang, and Jonah spun around, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching out like tendrils, reaching for him. A voice, faint but clear, echoed in his mind. "Leave, before it's too late." Jonah's eyes widened. The voice was not his own, and it was not a memory. It was something real, something that had been here long before he arrived. His pulse quickened. He needed to get out. He needed to leave before whatever was in this place could reach him. But the door was gone. The hallway had disappeared. Jonah was alone, trapped in the house, and the darkness was closing in around him. The air grew colder, the walls pressing closer, and Jonah felt a shiver run down his spine as the voice echoed again, louder this time. "Leave, before it's too late." And that's when he saw it. At the end of the hall, the shadows shifted. Something moved, something tall and dark, its form just out of reach of the dim light. Jonah couldn't make out the shape, but he could feel it, the weight of its presence, the pull of something ancient and malevolent. The voice whispered once more, this time almost a scream. But Jonah couldn't move. His body was paralyzed, frozen by the terror that gripped him. He had no choice but to watch as the shadows took shape, growing closer. until he could no longer escape the nightmare that awaited him. The door slammed shut behind him, and the darkness closed in. Jonah's breath hitched in his throat. The sudden, sharp darkness around him seemed to close like a vice, tightening with every passing second. His pulse was deafening in his ears, a thudding rhythm that seemed to match the quickening footsteps he thought he heard behind him. No, it couldn't be. It had to be his mind playing tricks on him. The room, the hallway, was silent again, but Jonah knew the silence was just a trap. It always was. He backed up instinctively, his heel scraping against something soft and yielding. A chair overturned. It didn't matter. He didn't care. He needed to leave now. His legs felt like lead, frozen, each step an agonizing decision. He turned toward what should have been the front door, but there was no door. There was no hallway. The house had shifted, rearranged itself in some unspeakable way, sealing him in this nightmare. The cold draft whispered through the walls, a soft, almost mocking sigh. Jonah swallowed hard, trying to swallow the rising panic in his chest, but it wouldn't go down. His eyes scanned the room, dimly lit by a flickering light bulb overhead, and landed on a small rickety table by the corner. On top of it, half obscured by shadows, was a dusty old photo frame. His feet moved of their own accord, and before he could think to stop himself, he was across the room, staring at the photograph. At first, he couldn't make out the faces in the photo, only blurry, indistinct figures. But as he wiped the thick layer of dust away, the image became clearer. His blood ran cold. It was a picture of a family, 2 adults, a man and a woman, and a little girl, all smiling in front of a house that looked remarkably like the one he stood in now. But something was wrong. The expressions on their faces were too stiff, too perfect, as if they were posing for something not right. Jonah's breath came in short, shallow bursts as he studied their faces. The man, his eyes were hollow, empty. The woman, her smile was wide, too wide, as though it didn't belong to her. And the little girl, her eyes stared directly at him, unblinking, with an intensity that made his stomach twist. Jonah couldn't tear his eyes away. He felt like he was being drawn into the photograph, like the eyes of the girl were pulling him deeper into the dark recesses of the house. He stepped back abruptly, his head spinning. Suddenly, the door behind him opened with a deafening screech. Jonah spun around, heart leaping in his throat, but the room beyond the door was not what it should have been. The hallway was gone, replaced by a long, dark corridor that stretched far beyond the reach of the dim bulb overhead. The walls were cracked, peeling, as if the house itself were decaying before his eyes. And the air, thick with the scent of mildew and rot, seemed to vibrate with an energy that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. A faint sound echoed down the corridor, distant at first, but slowly, unmistakably, growing louder. Footsteps. Jonah froze, his mind racing. There was no one else in the house. No one. The footsteps grew louder, closer. His breath hitched. He took a tentative step backward, then another. The floor creaked beneath his feet with each movement, but Jonah couldn't stop now. He had to move. The footsteps were almost upon him. The light above flickered, casting long, twisting shadows against the walls. He could feel the darkness pressing in on him like a living, breathing thing, and with it came the sense of being hunted. Then, without warning, the footsteps stopped. Dead silence. Jonah stood there, frozen, trying to hear anything that might tell him where to run, where to hide. His mind raced through 1,000 possible escape routes, none of them seeming real, none of them making sense. There was no way out. A soft whisper floated to his ears, too faint to make sense of, but clear enough to send a chill crawling up his spine. "Help me." Jonah's eyes darted around, his heart hammering. It was coming from the end of the hallway, from the darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. The voice, soft, desperate, almost childlike, called again. "Asterisk, help me. Jonah, Asterisk." Jonah's stomach twisted. The voice. It knew his name. He stepped back, but his heel caught on something and he fell hard, hitting the floor with a grunt. The echo of his fall reverberated through the house, mocking him. He scrambled to his feet, heart racing in his chest, and dared to look back toward the hallway. The shadows shifted slowly. Something, or someone, was there. He couldn't make out any details, but he could see it moving, stretching, its form growing as the darkness seemed to bleed into the very air itself. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. Jonah's breath came in jagged gasps as he stood there, caught between the terror of the unknown and the madness of the situation. His mind screamed at him to run, to get out, but his legs wouldn't obey. And then, from behind him, a soft voice, this time clear and cold as ice. "It's too late." Jonah spun around, but there was no one there. The room remained empty, silent. But the feeling of being watched didn't fade. In fact, it grew stronger. The air felt heavy with an ancient presence pressing down on him. His eyes darted toward the small window on the far wall. It was his only way out. He could feel the cold night air beckoning him through the glass, the faint promise of freedom just beyond the fog. Jonah made a run for it, his heart thundering in his chest. He reached the window and threw open the sash, but the moment his fingers brushed the edge of the frame, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Jonah spun around, his face pale with fear, and saw the shadow move again, this time with purpose. "You're not leaving." Jonah turned and ran, his mind frantically searching for an exit, a way out of the nightmare that seemed to have no end. He could hear the footsteps now, slow, deliberate, like someone pacing behind him, always just out of sight. The house itself seemed to twist and groan around him, the walls warping, the floors buckling beneath his feet. Jonah felt his legs give out, and he collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, his mind spinning in a haze of terror. And that's when he saw it, at the end of the hallway just beyond his reach, another photograph. A photograph of the same family from before, but this one was different. The smiles were gone, replaced with hollow, dead eyes. The little girl, her eyes were wide open, staring at him, not with innocence, but with something darker, something far more sinister. Jonah's eyes widened, his breath caught in his throat. The shadows reached for him, pulling him toward the photograph. And just as his fingers brushed against the cold glass, the house went dark. Jonah's heart hammered in his chest as the darkness swallowed him whole. For a moment he couldn't breathe. The air had turned suffocating, thick and heavy, pressing against his chest like invisible hands trying to crush him. He was still kneeling on the floor, but the world around him had shifted. The hallway, the walls, the house itself. It was no longer familiar. It had become something else, something darker. The silence was deafening. Jonah fumbled in the dark, his fingers brushing against the cool, damp walls, searching for something, anything, solid to anchor himself to. The house had stopped creaking, the wind had stilled, and the faint hum of the house's eerie energy had faded into nothingness. It was as though the house itself had held its breath, waiting for him to make the next move. Suddenly, a low creak echoed from behind him. Jonah's body tensed, a chill running down his spine as his eyes strained to make out the shadowed room. There, in the blackness, just beyond the reach of his senses, he could feel the presence of something watching him. The voice was back, whispering, soft and far away, yet unmistakable. "Jonah." He spun around, desperate to find the source, but there was nothing. No figure, no shape, just the oppressive darkness and the thick, cloying air. "Jonah." The voice was louder now. It was closer, as if the unseen thing had moved toward him. Jonah's heart seemed to stop for a moment, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't his name being spoken. It was something more, something deeper, a feeling that was alive in the walls themselves. The voice was not just speaking to him, but through him. He stumbled to his feet, his limbs unsteady as if they belonged to someone else. The house felt like it was moving around him, the floors twisting underfoot, the walls stretching toward him. Jonah reached for the nearest door, his hand shaking as he turned the knob, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, or perhaps it was simply not meant to open. "You can't leave," the voice whispered again, and this time it was not just a voice. It was a feeling, a presence, a force. Jonah could feel it curling around his insides, wrapping its cold fingers around his heart. He jerked back, suddenly realizing where he was standing. The photograph, the one he had seen earlier, the one of the family, was now on the floor before him, the glass cracked, the edges of the frame chipped and broken. But it was not the same photograph. The people in the image had changed. The man in the picture, once smiling, now had no eyes, just hollow black sockets staring back at Jonah, endless and empty. The woman's smile had twisted into a grimace, and the little girl, her eyes now wide open and unblinking, seemed to stare directly into Jonah's soul. Her mouth was slightly open, as though she were about to speak, but the words never came. Jonah could feel his skin crawl, his stomach tightening as the air grew colder. A distant rumble of thunder shook the house, but it didn't bring any comfort. It only added to the oppressive atmosphere, the pressure growing with each passing second. The house was alive. Jonah could feel it now. It was alive, feeding off of his fear, wrapping its tendrils around him. The door behind him creaked open, and Jonah spun around. For a brief moment, the hallway appeared as it had before, dimly lit and stretched into shadow. But then, as quickly as the light had returned, it flickered and vanished again. Jonah staggered back, disoriented, as he tried to make sense of what was happening. His mind raced, desperate for an explanation, for anything that could make sense of this madness. "Leave now." The voice, sharp and commanding, echoed through the house. But it wasn't the same voice. This one was older, more distorted, as if it had been buried in the walls for years, clawing its way to the surface. Jonah's body trembled, his legs barely able to support him. He glanced over at the shattered photograph again, his eyes drawn to it against his will. The little girl's face was no longer just a stare. Now it seemed to be moving. Her expression flickered, shifting between different faces, all twisted in terror. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. Only the silence, stretching further and further until it consumed him. Without thinking, Jonah turned and fled down the hallway, his footsteps frantic and unsteady. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to escape. Escape the house, escape whatever was here. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body didn't listen. Each turn, each corner, seemed to lead him deeper into the maze, into the very heart of the house. The house had become a labyrinth. Jonah's chest tightened, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. The shadows stretched before him, reaching out like fingers, the walls narrowing with each step. The house seemed to pulse with an energy, a dark and ancient presence that seemed to be breathing, alive. He reached out, his hand brushing against the wall as he tried to steady himself, but the surface felt wrong, slick, almost alive. The voice came again, louder now, more insistent. "Help me." Jonah stopped dead in his tracks, his head spinning. The voice wasn't just a whisper anymore, it was a scream. The sound seemed to echo from all around him, and he realized with sickening clarity that it was coming from behind him. Turning, he found himself face to face with a door he hadn't noticed before. It was small and narrow, like a servant's door, tucked away in the corner of the hallway. The wood was warped and decayed, the handle covered in rust. The voice was louder now, the words unmistakable. "Help me, please." Jonah stepped forward, drawn to the door as though something inside of it was calling him, pleading with him. His mind screamed for him to stop, to turn away, to leave, but his feet betrayed him. He reached for the door, his hand trembling as he touched the cold, rusted knob. "Help me." The door opened with an agonizing creak, the hinges protesting against years of neglect. Jonah stepped inside, and the room beyond was dark, the air thick with the smell of decay. There was no light, no source of warmth, just a crushing, endless dark. He could barely see his own hands in front of his face. And then he saw them. In the far corner of the room, in the depths of the shadows, he saw them. The same family from the photograph, the man, the woman, and the little girl. But they were not smiling anymore. Their eyes were black, hollow voids. Their mouths hung open, twisted in silent screams that reverberated through his bones. And the little girl, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, slowly, painfully turned to face him. "You should have never come here." Jonah's heart stopped as the darkness closed in, the last of his breath escaping his lungs. The door slammed shut behind him, and the house swallowed him whole. Jonah's vision blurred, a sudden, nauseating rush of vertigo crashing through him. The walls of the room seemed to breathe, pulsating with an almost sickening rhythm, as though they were alive, feeding off his panic. He stumbled backward, his feet catching on the cold, uneven floor, but there was nowhere to retreat. The family, those lifeless, empty eyes, remained frozen in place, their silent screams hanging in the air like a thick fog. The little girl's head tilted once more, her eyes piercing through him, and Jonah felt as if she were pulling him in, as if her gaze alone could tear his soul apart. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice, it wasn't the soft whisper he had heard earlier. This was different. This was cold, hollow, ancient. It reverberated through the room, sinking into his skin, his bones, and clawing at the edges of his sanity. Jonah could feel his body shaking, his knees threatening to buckle beneath him. His heart raced, a relentless pounding that seemed to drown out everything else. "Please, help me." The girl's lips didn't move, but the words seemed to echo in his mind, louder now, each syllable pressing against his skull like a physical weight. Jonah's breath hitched, his chest tight, as his gaze flicked to the other figures in the room. The man. His face was gaunt, a shadow of the man in the photograph, with sunken eyes and pale, cracked skin. The woman's smile, once so twisted, had turned into something far worse, a gaping, empty mouth that seemed to stretch beyond human limits. She was no longer human. She couldn't be. The room felt smaller now. The walls were closing in. Jonah's head spun with the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to the air, suffocating him, as if the very house itself was pressing down on him, forcing him into submission. The family's presence was suffocating, their unblinking eyes watching his every move. And then, the sound of a door opening. Jonah froze, turning his head with an almost desperate need to escape the oppressive stillness of the room. The hallway beyond was dark, shrouded in the same heavy fog of dread that had filled the house since he arrived. But this time there was something different, something new. A figure stood at the doorway. Jonah's breath caught in his throat. His vision blurred again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was because he was suddenly, unmistakably, unable to tear his gaze from the figure in the doorway. It was a man. Tall, thin, draped in black. But there was no detail to him, no flesh, no features. Just a dark silhouette, as though the shadows themselves had taken shape. It wasn't just that the man stood there, it was the way he stood, as if waiting for something, for someone. His presence filled the room, adding weight to the already suffocating atmosphere. Jonah's heart pounded harder, each beat a scream in his ears. "Come closer," the voice spoke again, clearer now, the words cold and inviting. "Come closer, Jonah." The man didn't move, didn't even breathe. Jonah didn't understand why he was so compelled, why his legs seemed to carry him toward the figure, step by agonizing step. But each step felt like he was walking deeper into something he couldn't escape. "You need to help me," the little girl's voice whispered again, desperate, broken. "Please." Jonah's head spun. The walls seemed to bend, the house shifting with every movement, its darkness wrapping around him, pulling him in like quicksand. His vision grew dim, his pulse erratic, his breathing shallow. He felt his body moving against his will, drawn to that cold, empty doorway. "You need to save us." The voice, soft, pleading, now joined by others, echoed through the room. He could hear it all around him. The whispers, the desperate cries, the promises of escape that would never come. Jonah's mind was racing, his thoughts disjointed. The photograph, the family, the house, the little girl. It was all connected. It had to be. He could feel the darkness swallowing him whole, and he realized, too late, that he had never truly been alone. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, and Jonah's breath caught. He could see nothing beneath the cloak of shadows. No face, no body, just an endless void that seemed to suck the very light out of the room. And that was when Jonah understood. The man wasn't a man at all. He was a part of the house. A part of whatever malevolent force had built this place. "You are the key," the voice whispered, now a chorus of many voices, all speaking at once, their words overlapping, indistinct, but all too clear. Asterisk, come closer. Come closer and understand asterisk. Jonah's legs moved of their own accord, despite the scream of every instinct in his mind telling him to run. His feet dragged across the floor, his hands trembling as they reached out toward the shadow, toward the darkness that seemed to stretch forever. He had to understand. He had to know what had happened here. What had happened to the family. What had happened to him. He couldn't escape the feeling that he was meant to be here, that the house was pulling him into something far deeper than just the physical space he stood in. "This is where you belong, Jonah." The moment Jonah crossed the threshold of the door, the air in the room changed. It was colder, much colder, his breath now visible in the thick, oppressive stillness. His heart beat so loudly he thought it would drown him, but there was no sound anymore. Just the feeling that he was being consumed by something far larger than himself. The darkness engulfed him completely. But the family, the photograph, was still with him, still watching him. He could hear their voices now too. The same chilling words, growing louder, their pain filling the air. And then, in the distance, the soft click of a door opening. Jonah's pulse quickened again, but there was no turning back. The path had been set. The house had chosen him. And when Jonah reached the end of the hallway, he saw it. The room. The place where it all began. The heart of the house. It was the attic. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight as he ascended, each step closer to the truth. The air grew thicker, the oppressive cold wrapping itself around him like a shroud. And there, on the far side of the room, sat a small weathered chest. Jonah didn't know why he was drawn to it, but he felt an undeniable pull. His hands shook as he knelt before it, the cold wood biting into his fingertips. And as he lifted the lid, the smell of decay and rot flooded his senses. Inside was a small, decaying doll, its face cracked and missing one eye, and beneath it, a letter. He picked up the letter with trembling hands, his mind racing with the dread of what he might learn. The letter was yellowed with age, the ink faded, but the words were still clear. "To whoever finds this, asterisk, you are the next. The house will claim you just as it claimed us. We are the family, lost, forgotten, waiting. You are the one who will break the cycle. You are the one who will release us. But be warned, it will not be without cost. The house does not give without taking. It demands a soul, asterisk. Asterisk, you are the key, Jonah. You are the key to all of this, asterisk." Jonah's eyes widened as he read the words over and over, trying to make sense of the madness. But the house, The house was already claiming him. The walls were shifting and the darkness was closing in. The family's voices were louder now, more desperate. Asterisk, you must make the choice, Jonah. Help us. Set us free, asterisk. But as the darkness closed in around him, Jonah knew one thing. There was no escape. Jonah stood frozen, the letter still clenched in his trembling hands. The words blurred before his eyes, the ink twisting and turning like a living thing, twisting into the shadows that pressed in from every side. The voices, the whispers, they were no longer distant. They were inside his head now, louder, more insistent, each one overlapping the other until it felt like his skull was going to split in two. Help us, Jonah. The words were soft but undeniable. They rang in his ears, vibrating deep within his bones. And yet, despite the suffocating dread that filled him, there was a strange pull, an undeniable need to listen, to understand. The photograph, the house, the family. It was all connected, but the answer remained just beyond his reach. Every step he took forward seemed to only bring him deeper into the nightmare, and he realized with a sickening clarity that the house had always been waiting for him. He couldn't escape. There was nowhere left to run. The attic felt smaller now. The walls seemed to close in with each passing second, and the cold had become unbearable, the air thick with the scent of mold and something far worse, decay. Jonah could feel it creeping up his spine, slithering its way into his thoughts, into his very soul. And then, from the corner of the room, a light flickered on. It was faint at first, just a glimmer in the oppressive darkness, but it grew brighter, illuminating a strange old mirror that Jonah hadn't noticed before. It was framed in dark, intricate carvings, symbols he didn't recognize, ancient and unsettling. Come closer. The voice was soft, almost seductive, pulling him toward the mirror. Against his better judgment, Jonah found his legs moving of their own accord, each step drawing him nearer to the reflection that was now casting a pale, unnatural glow across the room. He stopped just short of the mirror, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he gazed at his reflection. At first, he thought it was just his own image staring back at him, but then he saw it. Behind him, in the reflection, stood the family. The same man, the same woman, the same little girl. But their faces, oh God, their faces, they were different now. Twisted, contorted into grotesque masks of pain and suffering. Their mouths were open wide, stretching beyond human capacity, the air thick with their silent screams. The little girl's eyes were no longer hollow, now they were filled with something worse. A darkness that seemed to suck the light from the room, pulling Jonah into the depths of their despair. The man's figure blurred, distorted, and Jonah's pulse quickened as the room around him seemed to distort as well. The mirror was no longer just a reflection, it was a window into something else. A realm of shadows, a realm that was bleeding into his own. You can save us, Jonah. The little girl's voice echoed through the room again, but this time it was different. There was no pleading, no desperation. It was cold, detached. It sent a chill down Jonah's spine as the reflection of the family stepped forward, out of the mirror, their figures breaking free from the glass like smoke. Jonah staggered back, his heart racing. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be happening. He wasn't prepared for this. He wasn't prepared for them to come to life. The shadows that had once been confined to the mirror now loomed in front of him, tall and silent, their forms reaching for him as though they were stretching toward him, starving for something he couldn't yet understand. The girl's face flickered in the shadows, her eyes never leaving his, and for a split second Jonah saw something more than the dark void that had once been her eyes. He saw herself in the girl. You're just like us. Jonah blinked, unable to process the thought. The shadows grew darker, the air heavier, suffocating him with each breath. He backed away, but his legs felt as if they were stuck in quicksand, each step taking more effort than the last. The shadows, the family, they were closing in around him. The house was alive. It was changing him. His mind reeled. His heart slammed against his ribs, threatening to burst. And then, just as suddenly as they had emerged, the figure stopped. Help me, the little girl's voice whispered again, but now it was tinged with something darker, something deeper. Jonah's breath hitched in his throat as the truth began to take shape. The house wasn't just haunted. It wasn't just cursed. It was something far older, something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. It was alive, feeding off the fear and the souls of those who entered. You are the key. The words rang through his head like a drumbeat, deafening and unrelenting. And in that moment, Jonah understood. He wasn't here by chance. He hadn't wandered into this nightmare by mistake. He was here for a reason. He was the key. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of him. His mind scrambled for an escape, but there was no way out. The family, the house, they had been waiting for him. They had been waiting for him to find the letter, to open the door, to step into the attic. The house had been calling to him, pulling him closer with every step, and now, in the dim light of the attic, Jonah could feel the weight of its hunger. The house wasn't just alive, it was watching him, waiting. And the price for his freedom was far steeper than he could have imagined. Jonah's eyes darted back to the mirror. He couldn't look away. He saw it again, the faces of the family, trapped, writhing, begging for release. And in that moment, he realized that they weren't the ones who were trapped. He was. His heart hammered in his chest as the room seemed to spin around him. The darkness was closing in, swallowing him whole. "Help me." Jonah shook his head, backing away from the mirror, but the figure of the little girl stepped forward, her face twisted in anguish. "You must make a choice." Jonah couldn't breathe. His chest felt tight, like there was a vice around his ribcage. The choice. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to break the cycle, to free himself from this nightmare. But as the darkness crept in, he knew. Deep down, he knew that there was no way out. Not for him. Not for anyone. He was the key. The key to something far worse than he could ever have imagined. And as the family's forms converged on him, Jonah realized the horrible truth. He wasn't just trapped in the house. He was becoming a part of it. The room spun as Jonah's breath became erratic, his lungs struggling to drag in air. The darkness around him thickened, pressing down on his chest, weighing him with an unbearable pressure. His legs gave way beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor, his hands shaking as they scraped across the cold, rough surface of the attic. His vision flickered, light to dark, dark to light, and for a moment he thought he might pass out, the weight of everything threatening to pull him under. But the whispers, those damn whispers, wouldn't let him. "You're not going anywhere." The words seemed to curl around him like smoke, rising from the very walls of the house. The family's figures, his nightmares, his tormentors, had grown closer, their faces twisted in expressions that didn't belong to the living. The girl, the man, the woman, they were all there, standing just beyond the threshold of his shattered mind. They weren't just ghosts. They weren't just apparitions. They were something more. Something older. Jonah's heart pounded in his chest, the sensation almost painful, but it wasn't just fear he felt now. It was something worse. Something primal. It was as if the house was feeding on his terror, growing stronger with each beat of his heart, each flicker of his fractured thoughts. "You must choose," the girl's voice whispered again, cold and hollow, her tiny form stepping forward, reaching toward him. Her hand, a pale, bony thing, hovered just above his face, her eyes empty voids, her lips twisted into something grotesque, smiling as though she knew a secret Jonah wasn't ready to hear. He could barely breathe. His throat tightened, and yet he couldn't tear his eyes away from her. He couldn't look away from the others either, the man, the woman, each of them staring, unmoving, their gaze searing into his soul. And all of them, in unison, in a twisted choir, spoke. "Asterisk, you are the key, Jonah. You are the key to breaking us free, asterisk." His blood ran cold at the words. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body wouldn't obey. His legs felt like lead, his arms numb. The realization was dawning on him now, slow and agonizing. He wasn't in control anymore. The house was. The family was. And it was no longer about surviving. It was about becoming one with it. Jonah's mind scrambled, each thought a desperate attempt to make sense of the horror around him. The family, why did they look so familiar? Why was he so certain that they weren't the first? That they weren't the only ones to be lost in this place? The whispers had been right, hadn't they? He wasn't the first to be drawn into this nightmare. There were others before him. And there would be others after him. His eyes flickered to the attic door, half open, creaking on its hinges in the stillness. But the corridor beyond was shrouded in an inky blackness, deeper than any night he'd ever seen. He couldn't see past the darkness, couldn't make sense of it, but the pull, the overwhelming pull, was undeniable. "Come with us, Jonah." The voice was coming from everywhere now. It wasn't just the family anymore. It was the house itself, the very bones of it, creaking and groaning as if waking from some long, ancient slumber. The words filled his mind like a terrible song, haunting, inevitable. "Help us." And Jonah knew, deep down in his gut, that the house didn't just want him. It needed him. The house had been waiting for him. Had been calling to him from the moment he set foot in this forsaken place. His eyes darted back to the family. The man's mouth stretched impossibly wide, his lips curling into a grotesque smile that seemed to mock Jonah's every thought. The woman's arms reached out, long, skeletal fingers beckoning him forward. The girl, her face a mask of sorrow and rage, stood silently, watching him with those wide, hollow eyes. You must understand, the voice whispered. Asterisk, we are the house. And you are a part of us now, asterisk. Jonah's head spun with the weight of it. The family was trapped in the house, but so was he. And in that moment, Jonah realized something that made his stomach churn. The house wasn't cursed in the way he thought. It wasn't a mere haunted place, a place where spirits lingered. The house was a living thing, feeding on its inhabitants, drawing them in until they became part of it, until their very souls were swallowed whole. Jonah had been chosen not just because he was here, but because he had a connection to this place. A connection he couldn't yet understand. You must choose, the little girl's voice sang softly, breaking the silence. Choose Jonah. His hands trembled as they clawed at the wooden floor beneath him, pushing himself up, his legs weak, his body aching from the cold and the terror that held him in place. But his mind was spinning, racing, his thoughts colliding in a violent storm. He had to escape. He had to find a way out. But the house, asterisk, it knew, asterisk. It knew that he couldn't. That there was no escape. You will be ours, the voices echoed, growing louder, the shadows closing in. Asterisk, you are the key, Jonah. You will become one of us. Forever, asterisk. Jonah's breath came in ragged gasps as he crawled toward the door, his hands now slick with sweat. His heart was hammering in his chest, but the door seemed farther and farther away, the shadows growing longer, stretching like tendrils reaching to pull him back. And that was when he heard it. A sound that made the blood freeze in his veins. A soft, low moan rising from the depths of the house. A sound that wasn't a whisper. It was a voice he knew. A voice he had heard before. His father's voice. Jonah. Jonah's blood ran cold as the moan grew louder, closer. He turned to see the figure standing behind him, a figure wrapped in shadows and cobwebs. His father stood there, pale, eyes hollow just like the others. The man he had once known, once loved, was now nothing more than another ghost in this wretched house, another soul lost to its hunger. Jonah, help us. The words were the same, but they were more than words. They were a plea. A desperate, final plea for release. His father reached out, his hand shaking, but Jonah knew, he knew, that reaching out to him, helping him, would be the final step. The last step before he too would become part of this house. Part of its unholy legacy. Jonah's pulse raced. His breath came in gasps. You are the key, the house whispered again, now a single unified voice. You must choose. Jonah's mind spun, his body moving on instinct, his feet dragging him toward the door. His father's hand reached for him. The family, the house, the shadows, all pressing in. And Jonah knew. There was no choice. He stepped forward. And the house claimed him. Jonah's eyes snapped open, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. He wasn't sure when he had closed them. The darkness around him was thick, suffocating, and for a moment he thought he was still in the attic. But then he realized with a growing horror that something was different. The air was heavier now, filled with a thick, damp chill that made his skin crawl. He tried to move, but his limbs were stiff as though they didn't belong to him. Panic surged through him as he attempted to lift himself from the ground, only to find that his body felt foreign, sluggish. His arms, his legs, they were not his own. They were too cold, too still. A low, unsettling sound broke through the quiet, like a far-off whisper, a faint rustling, or perhaps the creak of the old house settling. Jonah's mind raced, but the silence that followed was far worse. It was the kind of silence that wrapped itself around you, tightening like a noose, suffocating your thoughts and keeping your mind locked in place. Where am I? The thought echoed in Jonah's mind, but there was no answer. The ground beneath him was no longer wood but something softer. Earth, damp soil, thick with the scent of decay. The air smelled of rot, of something foul and ancient. His throat tightened with an overwhelming sense of dread, but he forced himself to look around. He was no longer in the attic. Jonah's breath hitched as he saw the walls surrounding him. They were low, uneven, as though they had been hastily carved out of the earth itself. The dim light that flickered weakly from somewhere above cast long shadows that twisted and stretched across the walls. The space was cramped, a narrow passageway carved into what looked like stone, but it was slick and wet, as though it had been forgotten by time. And the air, God, the air, was thick with an oppressive weight, as if it was being held in place by something unseen, something ancient and malevolent. He was in the heart of the house, beneath it. Beneath the very foundation. Jonah's heart skipped a beat as he realized what that meant. The house isn't just alive. The thought crashed into him like a tidal wave, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. The house wasn't just some cursed building. It was a living, breathing thing, and it had drawn him down here for a reason. He had been chosen. The house had been waiting for him. A voice, the same voice that had whispered in his mind, rose from the shadows, low and guttural, the sound crawling along his spine like a living creature. Jonah. He froze, his skin prickling, a deep chill sweeping through him. The voice was distorted, hollow, but it was unmistakable. It was the same voice that had called to him before. It was the house, and it was calling him deeper into its depths. "You are one of us now." Jonah's breath quickened. He wanted to scream, to escape, but there was no escape. The walls seemed to close in on him, the narrow passageway stretching endlessly in front of him, the shadows swallowing everything in sight. There was no way out, no way to run. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady beneath him. Every step felt like a weight was pressing down on him, each movement slower than the last. The walls of this place, this underground prison, seemed to close in tighter with every step he took, each one carrying him deeper into the very heart of the house. His mind raced. The letter. The family. His father. He couldn't stop thinking about them, couldn't shake the image of their faces, their hollow eyes staring at him from the mirror. The house was connected to them. They were trapped in it, and now he was too. No. Jonah's pulse hammered in his ears as he reached the end of the passage. There in front of him was a small door, half open, its wood cracked and warped as if it had been untouched for years. The door led deeper into the bowels of the house. Jonah could feel it, the pull, the unrelenting force drawing him toward it like a moth to a flame. His hand hovered over the door handle. It was cold, slick with moisture, as though it had been waiting for him to touch it. He hesitated, his mind screaming at him to turn around, to leave, to escape. But the pull of the house was too strong, too insistent. The whispering grew louder now, a chorus of voices, all calling to him, all beckoning him forward. "Open it, Jonah." The door groaned as he pushed it open, and the moment he stepped through, the air changed. The temperature dropped, the oppressive weight of the place settling even heavier around him. Felt like a tomb. The room beyond was dark, but Jonah could make out the faint outline of something in the center, something large, something familiar. He took a step forward, his heart racing, his breath catching in his throat. The room was a cavern of sorts, the stone walls rough and jagged, the floor uneven, as though it had been carved out of the earth by something much older than anything he could comprehend. But that wasn't what caught his attention. It was the shape in the center of the room. A figure. Jonah's heart stopped. He knew who it was before he even saw their face. His father. The man stood in the center of the room, his body thin and gaunt, his skin pale, almost translucent. His eyes, wide and empty, fixed on Jonah as he stepped closer. His mouth moved, but there was no sound, just the hollow movement of lips stretched too far, as though they had been forced to form words that would never be heard. Jonah. Jonah's chest tightened as he took another step forward. His father's form flickered in and out of the shadows, shifting like smoke, his features twisting into something more grotesque with every passing second. The face he had once known was gone, replaced by something monstrous, something unrecognizable. Jonah opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He couldn't find his voice. His body was frozen, as if he were standing on the edge of a cliff, unable to look away, unable to move. The figure of his father reached out to him, its hand stretching across the darkness, fingers long and twisted, reaching for him like a promise, like a demand. The same chill he had felt in the attic crept over him again, and the air grew heavy with a presence that felt suffocating, overwhelming. "Come to us, Jonah." The voice rang in his ears, louder now, more insistent. The walls of the cavern seemed to pulse with each word, as though the house itself was breathing, drawing in the air around them. Jonah shook his head, the words echoing in his skull, his mind racing for a way out. But he knew, deep down he knew, that there was no escape from this place, from the darkness that had claimed him. The house was part of him now. The house was inside him. And as he took one last step toward the figure of his father, Jonah understood the terrible truth. He wasn't just a prisoner in the house. He was its next victim. And soon he would be the one calling to someone else. The world seemed to spin around Jonah, the edges of his vision blurring as his father's outstretched hand drew closer, its shadowy form grotesque and unnatural. The floor beneath him felt uneven, as though it was shifting, warping under the weight of what was about to happen. His pulse thudded in his ears, the relentless rhythm of his heart like a drum, urging him to run, to escape, but his legs wouldn't move. His body refused to obey. "You belong to us, Jonah." The voice was so clear, so present, that it was impossible to tell if it was in his mind or coming from the walls themselves. It didn't matter. It was everywhere, a constant hum in the back of his skull. Jonah tried to scream, to fight, but his throat tightened with an invisible force. The air was thick, heavy, like it had been pulled tight by an unseen hand, choking the life out of him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The figure of his father loomed larger now, a thing of shadows and memories, a twisted mockery of the man who had once been his protector. Jonah's thoughts spiraled. The image of his father, his eyes hollow and lifeless, seemed to distort further, becoming something alien, something monstrous. "Father," Jonah whispered, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers filling the room. His legs finally gave out beneath him, and he fell to the cold, damp floor with a thud. The darkness seemed to close in around him. He felt himself being pulled, dragged, as if by some invisible force. His body jerked, shaking uncontrollably. The walls of the room seemed to twist and fold, becoming jagged, oppressive. The shadows stretched like tendrils, reaching for him, suffocating him with their cold grip. Then everything stopped. For a brief, terrifying moment, Jonah found himself in an eerie stillness. The air, once thick with the oppressive presence of the house, was now dead quiet. His mind raced, spinning, desperate to find a way out. Was this it? Was this the end? The figure of his father, no, it wasn't his father anymore, stood still, motionless in the center of the room. The shadows that had once danced around him were now frozen in place. Jonah blinked, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The edges of the room, once dark and shifting, now seemed solid, unmoving. And then, as if from nowhere, the walls began to speak. Jonah. The voice was a chorus now, coming from every direction, every corner of the room. It was the house itself, the heart of it, pulsing with an ancient, evil life. Jonah's breath caught in his throat. He didn't want to listen, didn't want to hear, but it was impossible to block out. Asterisk Jonah, you are the key. The door? You must open it, asterisk. He felt a sharp, sudden pain in his chest, as though something had pierced him from within. He gasped, clutching at his heart, trying to steady himself. His body trembled with fear, but the pain didn't stop. It spread, radiating outward, taking over every inch of him. Open it, Jonah. The words were like a command. He could feel them pulling him, stretching him, tearing him apart. He closed his eyes, trying to focus, trying to push the pain away. He could still hear the whispers, could still feel the pressure of the house bearing down on him. Open it. Jonah's eyes snapped open. He was no longer on the cold floor, no longer in the cramped, suffocating room. He was standing in front of a massive door, its surface smooth and polished, an eerie, glowing light radiating from the cracks around its edges. The air around him was different now. It wasn't cold and damp. It was thick with heat, with something burning just beneath the surface. This is it, a voice whispered inside his mind, barely audible. You have to open it. Jonah's hand trembled as he reached for the door. His fingers brushed against its cool surface, and the moment he touched it, a jolt of energy shot through him. His body went rigid, his breath catching in his throat. The door shifted, creaking open just a fraction, and a wave of coldness swept over him. It was the same coldness, the same suffocating presence that had chased him through the house. But now, it felt different, more intimate, as if the house itself was beckoning him into its core. He pushed the door open, and as he stepped inside, everything changed. The room beyond was vast, an expansive cavern with walls that seemed to stretch up into infinity. The air was thick with a palpable darkness, the kind that seemed to twist and move on its own, as if it had a life of its own. There were no windows, no sources of light, just a deep, oppressive blackness that made it impossible to tell where the room ended and the void began. But at the center of the room was something waiting for him. A figure stood there, cloaked in shadow, its form shifting and distorting as though it couldn't quite decide what it was supposed to be. Jonah could feel it, feel its presence. It wasn't human, wasn't even close. It was older than time itself, something that predated the house, predated the family that had once lived here. It was the thing that had made the house what it was, the thing that had fed on their souls. Jonah. The voice was everywhere. It was in his mind, in his body, in the very air around him. He could feel it vibrating in his bones, a relentless pressure that pushed him forward, forced him to move. The figure in front of him reached out, its hands long and thin, almost skeletal, with fingers that seemed to stretch impossibly long. Come closer. Jonah wanted to scream, wanted to fight back, but his body wouldn't listen. His limbs were no longer his own. He was no longer in control of his movements. The figure's voice, the thing's voice, pulsed through him, binding him, chaining him to it. It was as though the house had merged with him, become a part of him, and now it was taking him deeper, further into its grasp. Jonah felt the cold touch of the figure's hand on his cheek, and he recoiled in horror. But there was nowhere to go. He was trapped. The darkness closed in around him, and the air seemed to compress, the pressure unbearable. "You are mine now," the voice whispered, its tone cold and final. Asterisk, you belong to me. You are part of this place now. And soon you will join the others. Asterisk. Jonah's breath came in ragged gasps. His body trembled, but he couldn't fight. He couldn't move. The house had claimed him, body and soul, and there was no escape from it. But as he stood there, frozen in place, something in the back of his mind stirred. A memory. A flash of something from before. He didn't know what it was, but it was there, pulling at him, pushing against the suffocating grip of the house. Fight. It was a whisper, faint but clear. A voice, familiar, calling to him from the depths of his mind. Jonah clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms, and for the first time since he had set foot in this nightmare, he felt something, a spark of resistance, a flicker of hope. "I will not be yours," Jonah whispered, his voice barely audible, but it was enough. The figure's hand recoiled as though struck, its face shifting in a flash of anger. The shadows around Jonah began to writhe, the air turning cold again as a deep, guttural growl filled the room. "You cannot escape," the voice roared. "You belong to us." But Jonah didn't listen. His mind was clearer now, his resolve stronger. He wasn't alone. Not yet. And he would fight. The growl reverberated through Jonah's skull like a crashing wave, and for a moment he thought his mind would shatter beneath its force. The shadows around him twisted. The very air seemed to warp with the presence of the thing in front of him. It was everywhere, suffocating him, but something inside Jonah, something raw and desperate, flickered, refusing to be extinguished. He took a step back, his legs still trembling, his body fighting against the unseen force that was pulling him deeper into the dark abyss of the house. The figure, the entity, whatever it was, shifted in the darkness, its form shifting like smoke, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Jonah could feel it closing in on him, pressing in on him from all sides. The walls of the cavern seemed to lean in, threatening to crush him. But something was different now. The suffocating grip that had once paralyzed him had loosened, just slightly, enough for him to feel the stirrings of something, resistance, defiance. "You cannot escape." The voice came again, louder, more furious, and Jonah felt a cold surge of fear rip through him. But he pushed it aside, feeling the heat of his own anger rising. His hands balled into fists, his knuckles cracking from the pressure. He wasn't going to be consumed by this thing, by this house. Not without a fight. "Leave me alone," Jonah shouted, the words breaking free from his chest before he could stop them. The echo of his voice bounced off the cavernous walls, distorted, lost in the chaos of the shadows. The figure let out a hissing sound, a low, guttural noise that reverberated through Jonah's bones. The air around him crackled, thick with static, as if reality itself was about to tear apart. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The pressure, the darkness, the whispers. The room was still, silent. And then it came. A blast of cold so intense it felt like his very soul was being ripped from his body. Jonah gasped, his chest seizing as the frostbitten air washed over him. His teeth chattered, his limbs locked in place. He felt himself slipping, falling deeper into the cold grip of the entity, its shadowy form growing larger, more menacing. "You are nothing." The words were a dagger, cold and sharp, cutting through his thoughts. Jonah struggled to breathe, to think. The pressure was unbearable, the weight of the house pressing down on him like 1,000 tons. He couldn't see. He couldn't move. And then, just when he thought he was going to be swallowed whole, a voice broke through the chaos. A voice he knew. "Jonah." His heart stopped. His name was spoken with such clarity, such certainty, that for a moment he didn't believe it. It was impossible. The voice was familiar in a way that made his blood run cold. "Jonah, wake up." Jonah's eyes snapped open. His breath caught in his throat, and for a second he thought he had imagined it. But then he felt it, something warm, something solid, holding him, anchoring him. "Jonah, come on, get up." The world around him was no longer suffocating, no longer dark and oppressive. He was back in the room with the low ceiling and the damp walls. The passageway he had fallen into. The weight of the house had lifted, the pressure gone, as though it had never been there at all. A figure loomed over him, bathed in the soft glow of light. A silhouette in the shadows. Jonah blinked, still disoriented, still reeling from the terror of the darkness. His heart was pounding in his chest. "Dad?" Jonah's voice cracked, barely a whisper. He could barely breathe. But the figure's voice cut through the fog of confusion. "No, Jonah. It's me. It's Emily. Emily." Jonah's heart skipped a beat. He tried to sit up, but his limbs were still heavy, his body uncooperative. His mind was still spinning, trying to make sense of what was real and what wasn't. He had been so sure he was lost, so sure he had been consumed by the house. But here she was, Emily, his sister. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with concern, but there was something different in her expression, something hard to place, something familiar. "Are you okay?" Emily asked, her voice tight with worry. She reached down and helped Jonah to his feet, steadying him as he tried to find his balance. Jonah looked around, his vision still blurry. The walls of the underground passageway seemed to pulse with a strange, ethereal glow, but they weren't closing in on him like before. The air wasn't thick with suffocating pressure. It was just a room. Just a room. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog in his mind. "What are you doing here?" he managed to ask. "I thought you—" "I'm not here to hurt you," Emily interrupted, her eyes flicking nervously to the shadows behind them. "I'm here to help." The words didn't make sense. They didn't fit with everything Jonah had experienced in the past hours, in the pit of darkness beneath the house. His mind was racing, trying to piece everything together. What was real? What had been real? Was Emily really here? Had she always been here? Before he could voice the questions that were pounding against his skull, Emily spoke again, her tone low, urgent. "Jonah, we don't have much time. The house, it's not finished with you yet. It's just playing with you. It wants you. It wants everything." Jonah's heart skipped a beat as her words sank in. He hadn't wanted to believe it, hadn't wanted to acknowledge what he had felt deep inside, the truth that had been gnawing at him ever since he stepped into this place. The house was alive. It was feeding on him. It was trying to break him, to drag him down into its depths. And now it had Emily too. Jonah's chest tightened. His sister. He wanted to ask how she knew all of this, how she could be so certain, but before he could get the words out, Emily grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the passageway. "We need to get out of here. Now." Jonah froze. Something was wrong. His mind, still clouded by confusion and the lingering effects of his terror, tried to make sense of the situation. Emily's grip on his arm was firm, but her eyes, those eyes, they weren't filled with the fear he had expected. They weren't filled with the love and concern of the sister he had known. No, there was something colder in them now, something that made his stomach churn. "You're too late," a voice whispered in the back of Jonah's mind, almost drowned out by the sound of his heart pounding. "Asterisk, the house owns you now. You can never leave, asterisk." Jonah pulled his arm away from Emily's grip, his mind still reeling. The shadows seemed to stretch, to reach for him, but this time he felt it. The coldness, the oppressive weight of the house wasn't just in the walls. It was in Emily too. "You're not her," Jonah whispered, the words slow and deliberate, the realization hitting him like a slap to the face. The shadows around Emily's form began to twist, to darken, and for a split second, Jonah could see it, the terrible truth. She was part of it now, and so are you. The words hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating Jonah as the realization hit him. Emily, his sister, wasn't standing in front of him anymore. Not the Emily he had known, not the girl he had grown up with. The figure before him was a twisted, hollow version, a reflection of something monstrous. Her eyes, once warm and familiar, were now black voids, empty, endless. The pale skin stretched taut across her face, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, sharp and cruel. The warmth he had once felt in her presence had evaporated, replaced with a coldness that made his blood run cold. You're not her," Jonah said again, his voice trembling, barely a whisper. But it was enough. The words felt like a fragile lifeline, something to hold on to in the overwhelming storm of terror that had consumed him. The figure, the thing that had once been his sister, tilted its head, a sharp, jerking motion as if considering him. Its smile widened, the darkness in its eyes deepening, expanding like an endless pit. "No," it said, its voice a low, rasping echo of Emily's. "I'm not her." Jonah took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest, but his legs were unsteady, as if the floor beneath him was shifting again. The passageway around him was closing in, the walls groaning, the shadows thickening like the tightening of a noose. "You've always been so easy to manipulate, Jonah," the thing whispered, its voice slithering through the air. "So easy to break. The house knew it. I knew it." Jonah's breath hitched as he backed away, his hands trembling at his sides. The house, it knew him? Had it always known? Had it been watching him from the moment he arrived? Was his descent into madness inevitable? The thing before him laughed, a sound that clawed at Jonah's sanity. It sounded like Emily's laughter, but there was something wrong, something cruel about it. It was the sound of a nightmare, a hollow echo that rattled his bones. "Why are you doing this?" Jonah managed to ask, his voice shaking. "What does the house want from me?" The figure, Emily, stepped forward, her movements unnaturally jerky as if she was both here and not here. Her voice softened, becoming almost tender, like it was trying to lull him into a false sense of safety. "It doesn't just want you, Jonah," she said, her voice a strange blend of coaxing and mocking. "It wants everything. It wants all of us. It wants the pain, the fear, the suffering. And it feeds on it." Jonah's mind raced, his thoughts spinning in 1,000 directions. Pain, fear, suffering, he had felt them all. The house had been feeding on him, pulling him deeper into its clutches with every step. And now, his sister was no longer his sister. She was a vessel, a puppet of the house, just like the others. He looked around, his eyes scanning the walls, the shadows that pressed in closer. The house, the place he thought he could escape from, the place he thought was just a haunted relic, was alive. It wasn't a building. It was a force, a presence that twisted and consumed. And Jonah had walked right into its trap. "What do you want from me?" Jonah asked again, his voice barely a whisper. The question felt empty now, like it had been asked too many times, and there was no answer left. Emily's hollow smile deepened, her eyes narrowing in a way that felt too familiar. She stepped closer, closer still, until she was just inches away from him. He could feel the cold emanating from her, like she was nothing but a shadow, a thing that no longer existed in the realm of the living. "Don't you see?" she whispered, her voice like ice against his skin. "You were always meant to be here. The house called to you, Jonah. It brought you here just like it's brought all the others. It's part of you now. And once it has you, once it breaks you, it will take everything." Jonah stumbled backward, the weight of her words crushing him. He felt his knees give way, the ground shifting beneath him. The shadows reached for him, like cold fingers wrapping around his ankles, pulling him down. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. "And oh," he screamed, his voice ragged, desperate. He tried to push away, to break free from the suffocating darkness, but the house had already claimed him. It had already woven its threads around him, pulling him deeper into its web. And then something snapped. The passageway, no, the entire house, shuddered. The walls groaned, the ceiling cracked, and the air grew thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. Jonah's eyes darted to the ground, and for the first time, he noticed something that had eluded him before. The symbols, carved into the floor. Strange, ancient markings that glowed with a faint, otherworldly light. Jonah's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. These weren't just random marks. They were a map, a path, a blueprint for something much darker. The house wasn't just trapping him, it was guiding him. It was leading him toward something, toward the heart of its malevolent force. Jonah's pulse raced as he looked back at Emily, at the thing wearing her skin. "What is it? What is at the center of this place?" he demanded, his voice shaky but determined. The thing's smile twisted into something dark and sinister. "You'll see," it said, its voice low, almost a growl. "You'll see it soon enough." Jonah's mind screamed for him to run, but his body wouldn't obey. The shadows were closing in now, thicker than ever, as if they were alive, as if they were breathing, wrapping around him, choking the very life out of him. He was no longer in control of his body, no longer in control of his thoughts. The house was too powerful, its influence too overwhelming. "Fight it!" The voice, the real Emily's voice, whispered in the back of his mind, but it was faint, distant, as though it was coming from another world. "Fight it, Jonah. You can't give up." He tried to push through the fog of terror, tried to hold on to the flicker of hope that had been burning in his chest. But the more he struggled, the more the house seemed to squeeze, to twist his thoughts, to bend his will. The air thickened and the shadows grew darker still. The walls of the house seemed to pulse, the floor buckling beneath him as if it were alive, breathing, waiting. Jonah could feel the entity closing in around him, the thing in his sister's skin reaching out, its long, twisted fingers brushing his cheek. "You can't escape, Jonah," it whispered. "You're part of this place now. And you always will be." And with those final words, Jonah knew. It was too late. The world around Jonah shattered. Not in the way things usually break, cracking with a sound like thunder or splitting with the slow inevitability of age. No, this was sudden, violent, and unnatural. The very air seemed to tear apart as if the house was splitting at the seams. The darkness wrapped around him, pulling him in every direction at once, suffocating him, until he thought he might collapse under the weight of it all. He could hear Emily's voice, distant now, lost in the howling void. It wasn't a voice that comforted him anymore. It was hollow, a wisp of something that was never meant to be. Her words cut through him like a blade, sharp and poisonous, making his bones ache with a deep, primal fear. "You are nothing. Nothing but a puppet. A plaything for this house. Jonah stumbled forward, his legs numb, his head spinning. The passageway before him had dissolved into an endless expanse of fog and shadow, the walls twisting like smoke crawling along the floor. Every step he took seemed to bring him closer to the edge of some unfathomable abyss. He couldn't see anything clearly anymore, just vague shapes, flickers of movement, and the echo of his own panicked breaths. But still, there was something deep inside him that fought against the pull of the house. There wasn't much, just a flicker, a spark, but it was enough. His heart hammered in his chest, adrenaline surging as he pushed himself forward, despite the overwhelming weight of despair pressing down on him. The shadows clawed at him, pulling at his skin, at his thoughts, but Jonah refused to succumb. He would not let this place swallow him whole. In the distance, so far away it seemed impossible, there was a light. A dim, flickering glow, as faint as a dying ember, but it was there. Jonah's instincts screamed at him to run toward it, to grasp it, to do anything to escape the suffocating grip of the house. He took a shaky step, then another, his mind screaming at him to stop, to turn back, but he ignored it. He couldn't turn back now. Not after everything. Not after what he had seen, what he had felt. This place had taken too much. It had already claimed so much of him. He wasn't going to let it take more. The fog around him began to swirl, thickening and tightening, like the walls of the house were closing in, forcing him into the center of the darkness. The shadows crawled toward him, twisting, bending into shapes that were familiar yet horrifyingly alien. Faces, terrifying, distorted faces, emerged from the fog, their mouths stretching into grotesque smiles. Jonah's stomach churned, and he stumbled backward, his hand instinctively reaching out to protect himself. But there was nothing to protect him. The laughter rose up, low and mocking. The faces of the lost souls in the fog stared at him with hollow eyes, whispering his name over and over again, their voices merging into a single, maddening chant. It was too much. It was unbearable. Asterisk Jonah, 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 asterisk. He clutched his head in his hands, willing the voices to stop, willing the shadows to go away. His breathing came in ragged gasps, his chest tight as if the very air around him was choking him. He stumbled forward, trying to push past the suffocating weight of the house, but the shadows clung to him, wrapping around his limbs like icy chains, dragging him down. And then, through the haze of panic, Jonah heard something. A faint sound, a whisper almost too quiet to hear but unmistakable. His name, but not from the shadows. Not from the house. Jonah? It was Emily's voice. But not the twisted thing that had stood before him. This was real. Her voice the way it used to be, full of warmth, full of love. Help me, the voice whispered again, a soft plea full of desperation. Jonah's head snapped up, his heart leaping in his chest. He blinked, disoriented, the fog thickening around him, but then, through the swirling shadows, he saw her. Emily. She was standing there just a few feet away, her face pale and drawn but still. Emily. Her eyes, though filled with fear, were still hers, not the black voids he had seen before. She looked like she had been through something unimaginable, her clothes torn, her hair matted with sweat, her skin bruised, but she was alive. She was real. Jonah, she whispered again, reaching out for him. Please, you have to listen to me. We don't have much time. Jonah's breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment he had fought for. His sister, his real sister, was here. He wasn't imagining it. The house had let her out. Emily, Jonah choked out, his voice barely a breath. He took a step forward, his hand reaching toward her, but the shadows seemed to fight him, pulling at his legs, at his feet, trying to keep him in place. No. Jonah, please? Emily's voice cracked, and she reached for him, her hands trembling. It's not over yet. You can't let it take you. You have to fight back. Jonah felt the weight of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had already been consumed by the house, already wrapped in its dark embrace. How could he fight it now? How could he break free when everything around him was twisting and tearing apart? The shadows were closing in again, faster this time, swirling in a frantic frenzy, like the house itself was aware of what was happening. It was trying to drag him back. Jonah felt a cold rush of panic seize him, his heart beating faster, but Emily's voice cut through the fog once more. Jonah, listen to me, she screamed, her voice desperate. You can do this. You can still get out. You have to. The light in front of him flickered again, just for a moment, but enough for Jonah to see the truth. The way out was there. It wasn't just some distant hope. It was real. He could escape. He wasn't doomed to die here, lost in this house of shadows. Jonah took another step, pushing against the weight of the darkness, his body trembling with the effort, but he forced himself forward, his hands reaching toward his sister. But before he could reach her, the shadows snapped. The darkness closed in faster than he could react. He felt his feet leave the ground, his body being lifted, pulled back into the suffocating fog, away from the light, away from Emily. No, Jonah screamed, but his voice was lost in the swirling chaos. The last thing he saw was Emily's face, her hands reaching for him before the darkness swallowed him whole. The darkness consumed him. It wasn't like falling asleep or fading away. No, it was more like being submerged in cold, relentless water. He could feel the pressure building, squeezing the air from his lungs, smothering him in its oppressive weight. It was a suffocating silence, the kind of silence that didn't comfort but suffocated, pressing down on his very soul. Jonah tried to move, but his limbs were heavy, like they were made of lead, anchored to the ground by unseen forces. His chest tightened, his heart racing in his ears, but no matter how hard he struggled, there was no escape. The shadows pressed against him, drowning him in their blackened embrace. His breath came in shallow gasps, every exhale a fight against the overwhelming suffocation. Where was Emily? Had she been real? Had she been a trick of the house, a final attempt to break him? Jonah's mind screamed with questions, but his thoughts were swirling together in a dark, chaotic mess, impossible to untangle. And then, slowly, agonizingly, the darkness began to lift. Not all at once, but in fragments, in thin cracks of light that filtered through the blackness like the first rays of dawn breaking through storm clouds. Jonah blinked, his eyes adjusting, trying to make sense of what was happening. His limbs still felt like they were moving through molasses, his head pounding with every movement, but he could sense something shifting. The shadows around him seemed to retreat, crawling away into the corners of his vision, disappearing into the fog. The suffocating pressure loosened, just enough for him to breathe, for him to think clearly again. And then, like a sudden explosion, the fog cleared completely. Jonah's eyes shot open, and he gasped in a ragged breath, his chest heaving. His vision was blurry at first, like he had just woken from a deep, disorienting sleep. But as the haze began to fade, he could see clearly. He wasn't in the house anymore. The room was different, familiar yet wrong. He was lying on the cold, stone floor of an old, forgotten chapel. The walls around him were adorned with symbols, crude, unnatural, etched into the stone with an eerie precision. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, damp earth, and something else, something sharp, metallic. The light he had seen earlier, it was here and now. The chapel was dimly lit by candles, their flames flickering weakly, casting long, grotesque shadows against the walls. There was no sign of Emily, no sign of the figure that had once called herself his sister. There was only the oppressive silence of this place, this forgotten, decaying chapel, the cold stone beneath him, and the lingering smell of decay. Jonah pushed himself up, his body trembling as if it had forgotten how to move. His hands shook as he touched the cold floor, his fingertips brushing against the strange symbols etched into the stone. His heart pounded in his chest, but something in his mind, some primal instinct, told him to get up, to move, to escape. But there was nowhere to go. As he stood, the chapel seemed to shift, the walls stretching outward, the ceiling looming above him like the weight of the world. The air felt wrong, too thick, too heavy. The candles flickered again, their light casting long, dancing shadows that twisted and writhed against the walls. Jonah turned, his eyes darting around the room, and that's when he saw it. The altar. At the far end of the chapel, draped in tattered, blood-stained cloth, was an ancient altar. It was made of dark stone, carved with the same symbols that adorned the walls. A faint, sickly light pulsed from within it, a dim glow that seemed to beat like a heart, echoing through the chamber. Jonah's heart skipped a beat. The altar, it was calling to him. It was the heart of this place, the center of everything that had been happening. It was the thing that had been feeding on his fear, on his pain. He could feel it in the air, like the very walls were alive, thrumming with some ancient power. And then he heard it. A voice. Not Emily's. Not the thing that had worn her skin. No, this voice was deeper, older. It vibrated through the air, sending a shiver down his spine, filling his mind with dread. Jonah? His name, spoken with a chill that sunk deep into his bones, froze him in place. Jonah, the voice repeated, this time closer, almost a whisper, a low hum in the back of his mind. He turned, his eyes scanning the room for the source of the voice, but saw nothing. The chapel was empty, save for the altar, the candles, and the faint, flickering shadows. You should not have come here, the voice continued, its tone mocking, almost playful. This place, this place does not welcome the living. It welcomes only those who have lost their way. Jonah's breath hitched. The voice was not just in the air, it was inside him, filling his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like a noose. The air seemed to grow colder, the temperature dropping with every word, every syllable. He tried to take a step back, but his feet were rooted to the ground, as though the very stone beneath him had come alive, gripping him in place. "I don't belong here," Jonah gasped, his voice shaking, desperate. I was just passing through. I didn't mean to." "You were always meant to be here, Jonah," the voice interrupted, its tone turning darker, more insistent. "You were brought here. Brought to the altar, to the heart of the house. You have always been a part of it." Jonah's mind raced. The words were like daggers, twisting his thoughts, cutting deeper into his understanding of what had happened. The house, the chapel, it was all connected. It wasn't just some abandoned, haunted place. It was alive. It had been feeding on him, pulling him closer, inch by inch, until he was right where it wanted him. The altar, he had to destroy it. He had to stop it. But how? He looked around frantically, his eyes locking onto the symbols on the walls, the strange, cryptic shapes carved into the stone. They were all part of the ritual, all part of whatever twisted magic had bound him to this place. The voice laughed, low and rumbling, as if it knew what he was thinking, as if it could see into his very soul. "Do you think you can stop it, Jonah?" the voice asked, its tone dripping with disdain. "You are nothing. A puppet. A victim." But Jonah's mind snapped into focus. He couldn't give up. He couldn't let it take him. There was something he could do. He didn't know how, but the desperation in his chest, his need to survive, to break free, pushed him forward. He moved toward the altar, his body trembling, every step a fight against the overwhelming presence that seemed to press down on him from all sides. He didn't know what to expect. He didn't know what he could possibly do to stop it, but he had to try. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the cold stone of the altar. The moment his fingers brushed against it, the light pulsed brighter, almost blinding. The voice, no, the entity, screamed, a sound that tore through his mind, through his very being, as if it were being pulled from its deep, dark prison. And oh, it roared. And then, in that moment, everything went silent. The shadows, the voice, the suffocating presence of the house, they all disappeared, leaving Jonah standing alone in the dim light of the chapel. The altar was still before him, its pulsing light gone. The air felt different now, clearer, lighter, as if the weight of the house had lifted. But Jonah knew, deep down in the core of his being, that it wasn't over. The house had let him go for now, but it wasn't done. It would never be done. The darkness had a hold on him now, and it would follow him wherever he went. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying thing of all. As Jonah took a deep breath, the faintest whisper tickled his ear. "You can never escape.